Holy mother of God, I am so late with the story time. Throughout the over 4 years that I've been doing Storytime, I've not had the best record when it comes to recording and releasing Storytimes on time, as I'm often a day or two late. Sometimes up to a week if I'm not particularly feeling well on the supposed recording night or have something going on. However, let's just say that these past few Storytimes have been really late, as I was almost 5 months late on Storytime 60 and 2 weeks late on Storytime 61. But none of these were as late as this Storytime, as this Storytime is over a year late. I was supposed to finish writing the script for this Storytime and record it sometime in early December of 2023. It's now 2025, meaning I am now over a year late on the Storytime. But since I of course never got past just the summer of 2019 when writing the Storytime, I left the ERS series unfinished for so long now, so I figured that I would write and release this edition of the ERS series to continue the series, as well as write parts 7 and 8 to ultimately put an end to this unfinished series. With that all said, my sophomore year of high school has got to be by far one of the most interesting school years for me to look at. That's because this was the 2019 to 2020 school year, a school year that will go down in history due to the COVID-19 pandemic that began in March of 2020, causing me and pretty much every other student to have to attend school virtually to stop the spread. And while I'll talk quite a bit about doing online school in the last quarter of the story time, that's not the only reason 10th grade was so crazy, as it also was memorable due to my academic achievements, natural disasters, and by far the biggest scandal my high school ever had in its 16 years of existence. There was also a ton of non-school related things that occurred during this time too. So I figured that for part 6 of the extensive reflection project, I'll discuss all the events that happened during my 10th grade school year and showcase why this school year was just so damn crazy. I'm Zach, and this is Storytime 62 on February 21st, 2025. So before I begin, I want to first remind y'all that this is part 6 in an 8-part series I am doing where I reflect over my school years. In the last part, which was of course part 5, I discussed my 9th grade school year as well as the summer prior to starting 9th grade, that being the summer of 2018. If you haven't seen it, then I would highly recommend watching it first so that you're not completely lost in the story time, since I'll be referencing it as well as parts 1, 2, 3, and 4 quite a bit in the story time. Now, just like how the other parts are structured, I'm first going to give y'all a backstory, where I'm basically going to discuss where I went to high school, as well as summarize the end of part 5 for y'all. I'll also refresh y'all on church, since like part 5, it too will play a big role in the story time with regards to religious trauma. Then to wrap up the backstory, I'll talk about what was going on with my life at the time, and talk about why 2019 was a very special year for me. Afterwards, I'll discuss the summer prior to 10th grade, that being the summer of 2019, and then I'll discuss the school year itself. So to start, let's talk about school. So as discussed in part 5, the high school I attended was not like most high schools, as it was an early college. Here, students can earn a high school diploma and an associate's degree at the same time for free, allowing them to knock off 2 years of college and take some college courses. The school is attached to the local community college, which is of course where we took our college classes. And like regular college, students have to apply if they want to go here, which they do in 8th grade. I was very lucky to be amongst the students selected, allowing me to enroll here for 9th grade and then of course spend my high school years attending this school. If I haven't made it clear throughout the almost half a decade I've been doing Storytime, I love this school and I'm so glad I chose to attend, as it's an experience I honestly wish I could experience again, because I just had a great experience here and would wholeheartedly encourage anyone interested in attending an early college to apply. Now, another thing that made my school stand out was that in addition to being an early college, it also followed the expeditionary learning curriculum. This is a different type of learning that focuses more on actually doing stuff, as well as exploring different topics within the curriculum such as acts of kindness, the natural world, the having of wonderful ideas, and more. I thoroughly enjoyed this type of learning as a freshman and look forward to seeing more of it in sophomore, junior, and senior year. Now, in addition to adding the curriculum into our high school classes, it was also incorporated into a thing called intensives. Intensives are a little difficult to explain, but pretty much they usually either involve us taking a field trip or a field trip coming to us. These intensives were used to help guide us with answering our grade's fundamental question. In freshman year, that question was, who am I? So therefore, we did a couple of intensives that corresponded with answering that question, as well as wrote an essay alongside each intensive in our English class. As a refresher from part 5, some of the things we did for intensives included rock climbing, taking a tour around our city, and building bridges, all with the aim of answering the question of, who am I? For sophomore year, that question was, how do I make good choices? On our second to last day of freshman year, being May 20th, 2019, the sophomore teachers took us freshmen for a day and we explored the idea of making good choices and why it's important. Then as sophomores during the school year, we did 2 intensives as well as a mini intensive that corresponded with the idea of making choices. These intensives were, in my opinion, a lot more memorable than the ones from freshman year, and I'll explain each one in depth when we get to each one. So that's a little bit of a refresher on how my school worked. Now let's talk about church. So my relationship with church has for the most part been very rough. In part 1, I went into detail about being picked on and being beaten by a deacon's 2 kids nearly every Sunday morning, Wednesday night, and vacation Bible school. I then talked about us switching churches to a new small one that had no kids in public school other than me and my younger sister Zoe, nor had anyone our age. Then in part 4, I talked about how our family switched to a much larger church that had a lot of kids in public school, as well as many people of mine and Zoe's age. At first, this was really good for us since we were welcomed with open arms and quickly became friends with those in our grade. The guys I was friends with in particular became especially crucial for my upcoming 8th grade school year, where I would deal with a multitude of mental health issues including depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideology that led into more serious issues such as suicidal thoughts, self-harm, and an attempted suicide. After my attempt, my classes were switched to be with those from my church, and these guys pretty much did everything they could to make sure I was happy and mentally stable. However, my relationship with them was short-lived, as in June of 2018, I attended a church trip with these same guys called Fuge. It was here when they revealed themselves as fakes, as they left me out and then made fun of me for it. They would do the same thing at a church trip called Winter Retreat 2019 the following January. But despite their bullshit, I still wanted to be friends with them and given that they still helped me during a difficult time. So I tried as hard as I could throughout my 9th grade school year to become closer with them, but my effort was not only enough, they still treated me horribly and I could not redeem my friendships with them. Even though by May, I was about ready to give up, I was still not done yet, although I would give up soon afterwards. I should also mention that my church's denomination as well, since its denomination and what it believed also turned me away. So the church we went to was a Southern Baptist church. My family has always been very Baptist for a long time. In fact, I'm the first person in my family since my great-grandmother to not be Baptist and the first ever atheist in the family. While most of this was because of how I was treated by my now former church, I also began disagreeing more and more with most of my church's teachings, as well as a lot of other evangelical doctrines that I left the religion entirely. I'll talk more about my dissatisfaction with church when we get to July. So that's what was going on with church at the time. So now to wrap up the backstory, let's talk about the time period I was living in during this time. So during this time, I was living through post-depression period part 2. I got to experience part 1 from March to November of 2018 after I was cured of depression, although it ended due to issues regarding swimming and conflict with my English teacher, putting me into the intermission period, which was a very sucky time period. But after my parents finally let me quit swimming on March 23rd, 2019, as well as when me and my teacher's relationship became much better, I got to enter post-depression period part 2, which I would experience all the way until March 15th, 2020. This was an absolutely amazing time period that, just like part 1, allowed me to live some of the best days of my life and put me at an all-time high in terms of happiness. Because of this, 2019 would go on to be the best year of my life for the next 5 years, as it wouldn't be until 2024 when that took that spot, making 2019 as of this story time the second best year of my life. The summer of 2019 was especially amazing, tying it with the summer of 2021 as the second best summer of my life, only behind the summer of 2018. So that's all the backstory I want to mention for the story time. So now let's get into the actual thing. To start, let's discuss how my schedule worked the day after my last day of 9th grade. So from May 22nd all the way until June 6th, I had the house to myself till 3:30. As while I got out of school the week before Memorial Day, Zoe did not get out until the second Friday of June. Mom was the same way, since she was a 4th grade school teacher at a public school in Zoe's district. Therefore, I pretty much got to relax for the next couple of weeks and enjoy the house alone, which was really nice. And the best part was that these days not only got better on Saturday, May 25th. So in part 5, I talked about how during dinner the night after getting back home from Fuge, we talked about my goals for the upcoming school year. In that discussion, Mom and Dad said that if I brought home A's and B's in both my high school and college classes, they would buy me a Switch. Throughout the freshman year, I did in fact make A's and B's, although I completely forgot about this incentive. So you can likely understand how shocked I was on May 25th when my parents came home with a Switch and a copy of Mario Kart 8 Deluxe alongside a Nintendo Switch Online subscription. I quite nearly shit my pants, but when they reminded me of the incentive, I calmed down a little bit and remembered what was going on. It was a strange incentive though, since they usually expected me to make all A's for awards, given that they gave me a Wii U when I made all A's back in 6th grade. But hey, I sure ain't complaining. So after talking with them some more, I got my Switch set up and spent all night playing Mario Kart the same way I spent all night playing Super Mario Maker with my Wii U on that amazing day that I discussed at the end of part 2. My parents also promised to renew my Switch Online subscription each year for good grades, which they did until 2022 when I began paying it myself. Now, playing through the game and exploring the DLC tracks and characters I didn't have access to in the Wii U version was super magical, as the DLC tracks overall are really cool and interesting. The Switch version is also just a lot more optimized and has extra features like Ultra Mini Turbos, and overall, I thoroughly enjoyed playing it through. And I 100%ed the game pretty quickly. At the time, to 100% Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, you had to collect 3 stars in all Nitro, Retro, and bonus cups in all classes, so from 50cc to 200cc. This was before the DLC came out, which came out 3 years later, so you only had half the tracks to master that you have today. Nonetheless, this game is much easier than other Mario Kart games to get 3 stars in, as you simply just have to win first place in every cup. So I did that in pretty quickly, even in 200cc, which also became my new favorite game mode in the game as well. However, because I beat the game so quickly, I became a little bored once I got 3 stars in all cups. That's when I decided to do some research and found it had a very active speedrunning forum on speedrun.com. I had just recently become interested in speedrunning after watching a Pokemon Emerald speedrun being performed at Games Done Quick back in March. So from then until really the rest of 2019, I began speedrunning Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, which involved either trying to beat all cups in 150cc or 200cc as fast as possible, or beating specific groups of cups, aka Nitro tracks, Retro tracks, or bonus tracks, or even beating individual cups. This was perfect for me since there was a lot of different tracks offered and the rules for submitting records were very relaxed, so I spent a lot of my summer doing speedruns. In July, I would begin live streaming my speedruns, which I'll get to in a bit. By the way, I'll attach the Pokemon Emerald GDQ speedrun in the description since it's a super fun speedrun to watch, and the runner, Tyrant14, along with the commentators, did a fantastic job explaining the strats too. So, that's really all that happened the rest of May. Let's move on to June. June 2019 was overall a really good month. The first week worked practically the same as the last week of May. Mom and Zoe were still in school, so I had the house to myself for the week. Well, every day except that Friday. So Friday, June 7th, was Mom and Zoe's last day of school. They wanted to celebrate the end of the year and asked if I was cool with going with them, to which I was. So that morning, I went with Mom to school and got to meet her students. She taught 4th graders, which in our district was the last grade of elementary school, as these 4th graders would go on to the intermediate school for 5th and 6th grade. I didn't do that since, as discussed in part 1, I went to a different school district for elementary school that had 5th grade. So I went up to 5th grade for it, and then I transferred to this district for 6th grade and went to the intermediate school just for that year, which I discussed my experience with in part 2. But to get back on topic, I got to talk to the students about intermediate school and what it was all entailed, even though it had marked exactly 3 years since my last day of intermediate school. But I still remembered a good bit and was able to tell them some insight, so I was able to help them out there. Ironically enough, a little while later, me and Mom went over to the intermediate school to see Zoe's award ceremony, since Zoe was finishing up 6th grade. Zoe won quite a few rewards, including scoring the most AR points in the school. AR, or Accelerated Reader, is this program for students from 1st to 8th grade in my state where they read books and take quizzes on them on an online platform. Each book is worth a certain amount of points, and you have to score a certain amount of points to reach your teacher-assigned goal. I went into a lot more detail on this back in part 2, but that's pretty much the gist of it. Anyways, the intermediate school gave an award to the student who scored the most points during the school year. Zoe, being the bookworm that she was, scored the most, so we got to see her win that award. It was really cool to see, especially since she scored more points that school year than I did my entire time in school. I've never been a fan of reading, which might come off as surprising since I've written a full-fledged novel and I'm writing a second one right now, but I've personally never been into reading just because of how much I hated AR. Afterwards, we had lunch and then we went home, wrapping up the school year for Mom and Zoe. The next week wasn't anything too memorable, just simply laying around the house and stuff. But the following week would be quite eventful. Let's start with Sunday, June 16th. So that day, as an early birthday present, as my actual birthday was 5 days later, my parents bought me a copy of Pokemon Let's Go Eevee, a game I had always wanted to play since it was announced. Even though I wasn't a big fan of more Kanto remakes, which is exactly not what we needed, I still enjoyed the idea of a main series Pokemon game being on the Switch and decided to give it a playthrough. While nowhere near as fun as Pokemon Platinum or Scarlet and Violet, I did have a blast playing this game, even staying up till 3 AM that night playing through the game. I also enjoyed the idea of using all 3 starters in one playthrough, especially considering that Charizard, Blastoise, and Venusaur are all really fun Pokemon to use in any playthrough. I ended up beating the game on Tuesday, June 18th, and I'll explain in a little bit what made beating this game unique compared to other games since it also marked a turning point in my YouTube channel. Anyways, the day after getting Let's Go Eevee, being Monday, June 17th, I had my first day of driver's ed. So the high school I was supposed to go to that had I not attended early college offered a 2-week driver's ed program for anyone, even if they didn't attend school there. So Mom signed me up for it and I attended it every weekday for a whole 3 hours from Monday, June 17th to Friday, June 28th. So how the driver's license progression works here in North Carolina is that you usually take driver's ed at 14 and a half, then get your driver's permit at 15, which is where you can drive with the parent or guardian. Then at 16, you can get your license, but you're limited to only being able to drive by yourself from 5 AM to 9 PM. Then at 16 and a half, you can get your restrictions removed. As you'll come to find, this process was a little trickier for me since I happen to have a summer birthday, which is why I didn't take driver's ed until 4 days before my 15th birthday. Anyways, driver's ed took place in a lecture room in the school's auditorium, so at least the seats had cushions and weren't hard like normal school chairs, which was definitely needed for a class where we were spending 3 hours of lecturing, but because holy shit was this class boring. Like, even though I never fell asleep in class, I was still really close to it almost every day of the class. Not only was it, of course, 3 hours a day, but I also knew pretty much everything discussed since I had already been driving with Mom and even driven on main roads. I even drove on the interstate for the first time that Tuesday, which I'll touch on then. But pretty much everything my teacher discussed was honestly just common knowledge. So things like don't drink and drive, stop at a stop sign, give the right of way to others when doing a left turn, that stuff. Well, at least it should be common knowledge, but I guess it isn't given how many people are going to prison for killing someone while drinking and driving, as well as how obnoxiously dumb and aggressive drivers here in the Charlotte area are. As someone who regularly commutes in Charlotte and has been the victim of a hit and run, I can confirm that many drivers have no idea what the fuck a turn signal is or even have any patience. Perhaps the reason they are this way is because they all slept in driver's ed, since I saw quite a few people fall asleep in that class when taking it. So that's how driver's ed went. The only saving grace to it was that Lucas, a friend from school, was also taking it here, so I at least got to see him, but otherwise, driver's ed was super boring. So now let's jump to Tuesday, June 18th. So the night after driver's ed was interesting. During this time, Mom was a grad student pursuing a master's in education at UNC Charlotte, which would also go on to be where I attended college. Even though her classes were all online, she was doing a group project with a fellow classmate and needed to meet with her in the library to work on it. Additionally, she wanted to get my help with it using the Google Slides and Docs, since I have a lot of experience using these tools. So that's what we did. After driver's ed, we stopped and got Subway, and then we headed off to UNC Charlotte. Once she parked the van, we went over to the Atkins Library, which is this huge tower that overlooks campus and the surrounding area. We didn't go to the top or anything, we just went to the first floor over to where the computers were. There, we met up with Mom's partner, and then the two of us started talking about the project and their intentions with it. Eventually, my role was in place when they asked about designing the presentation, so I helped with the design as well as added some animations to it. In part 3, I talked about taking a class called Technology and Innovation as one of my labs back in 7th grade. This is the class where I learned a ton of Google Slides tricks and design techniques, so I was able to apply them here to help Mom out on her project. Afterwards, they were able to add information and pretty much finish the rest of the project without me, so I spent the rest of my time playing Let's Go Eevee. Then once they finished, it was time to go back home, but before we did that, we decided to drive around campus so I could get a feel for what being on a college campus was like. Even though I was only a rising sophomore and wouldn't begin the process of applying to college for another 2 years, it was still good for me to see what being on a campus would feel like, especially since this college would ultimately be where I attended. And now as an alumnus who graduated almost a year ago, I could safely say that choosing to go here was a great decision. It also gave me some experience driving on a college campus, as Mom let me drive on campus. Afterwards, we went home. Mom let me drive on the way home, which was a very scary since it was my first time driving on an interstate, that being I-85. But it was past rush hour, so it wasn't completely bad, especially since I had to drive through Charlotte. So I also got a little bit of experience driving on an interstate in a big city as well. Then to wrap up that night, I would do something regarding my YouTube channel that would forever change it for the better. In part 5, I discussed the restrictions that were imposed on my YouTube channel and my upload schedule as a result of what happened back in part 4. Some of those restrictions included only uploading once a week, disabling comments, and disabling the like to dislike ratio on my videos. As a result, many of my videos from the second half of 2018 and the first half of 2019 were obnoxiously cringy and just downright some of the worst videos I've ever recorded and released in my almost 9 years of doing YouTube. However, times were different now. I was no longer a depressed 13-year-old 8th grader being bullied every day at school, being sent death threats online, stabbing myself every night, or having suicidal thoughts. I was now an almost 15-year-old rising sophomore that was way past all that. To say that 13-year-old me was the same person as the 20-year-old man that I am today, or even 15-year-old me back in 2019, would be wide of the mark, as I'm nothing like 13-year-old me now. So therefore, I decided that at this point, I did not need the restrictions. It also helps that the man who sent me death threats on YouTube would see his downfall the following month, which I'll of course discuss when we get to July. So the way I celebrated my removal of my restrictions was by uploading not 1, not 2, but 3 videos that night, all with comments enabled and a like to dislike ratio available, since this was before dislikes were removed. These videos were all on Let's Go Eevee, where the first 2 videos were me simply beating the Elite 4, Lorelei and Bruno in video 1, Agatha and Lance in video 2, and then the video 3 was me beating the champion, so somewhat similar to what I had been doing for the past year, but this time, I recorded myself beating the entire Pokemon League rather than just the champion. And unlike my videos from the year before, these were actually great videos and not the cringy ones I uploaded previously. Additionally, since comments and the like to dislike ratio were enabled for the first time in March of 2018, I received a lot of activity on my videos. I had a multitude of comments on all 3 videos, most of which were very positive and encouraging, with the only exception being some 8-year-old begging me to return to Dempamin. But needless to say, these 3 videos were successful and proved that I no longer needed the restrictions, although I still used them a little bit for a YouTube series I began roughly a week later that I'll talk about then. For now, let's skip over to Friday, June 21st. This is a special day since it was of course my 15th birthday. It was also a unique day for driver's ed, so our teacher taught 2 classes at different times. I was a part of the 1 p.m. section, but he also taught a 9 a.m. section. But on this day in particular, since an eye doctor was coming to do an eye test on all of us, he had to combine both sections into one class, which he did holding a class from 11 to 2, meaning I had to get up a little earlier, but not terribly early. As for the eye doctor, nothing memorable happened. He simply examined my eyes and did an eye test. He did say that I would be required to wear my glasses while driving, but considering I already have to wear my glasses for literally everything else, I didn't mind all that much. Anyways, after driver's ed, Mom, Zoe, and my grandmother picked me up and we had a late lunch. We went over to that same restaurant I mentioned in part 5 where Dad announced he was letting me and Zoe quit swimming. We also sat outside and played the ring toss game like our visit before. Then later that night for dinner, we went and got pizza. And honestly, that's all that happened on this day. It was a very uneventful birthday, which is what I like since I've never been one for birthday attention. Additionally, this is also a very relaxing birthday, especially since my 14th birthday was by far the worst birthday I ever had, which I talked about in part 5, so it was nice to go back to having an uneventful birthday where I did a little bit, but not too much. So with that all discussed, let's talk about the following week, as it was far more eventful than the week before. The reason being is that this week from Monday, June 24th to Friday, June 28th, my church hosted their annual Vacation Bible School, VBS. Now, I know it's been a while since I discussed VBS, so I'll refresh y'all on what it is and talk about how my church did VBS, since it did VBS way differently than my previous 2 churches. So, VBS is this week-long program that churches across the nation do for elementary school students. Here, kids basically get to practice in a wide variety of different things aimed at teaching them stories and teachings from the Bible. This involved traveling between a multitude of different stations, including crafts, recreation, Bible lessons, music, and others. Each VBS is centered around a certain theme. For example, for VBS 2012, the theme was centered around airplanes. Therefore, all of our songs were centered around airplanes, our crafts were based on airplanes, and the church itself was decorated in aviation-based attire. In 2013, the theme was roller coasters, and in 2014, the theme was secret agents. Now, while this is just an excerpt from part 1, you might be confused as to why I'm bringing VBS up in this story time, since this story time is about my 10th grade school year and the summer prior to it. Well, the reason is because VBS at my church was run by the youth. At the beginning of the month, our youth pastor provided sign-up sheets one day after Sunday school for us to sign up for if we wanted to participate in VBS. My parents were really pushing me to sign up to volunteer for it, especially since I didn't volunteer the year before. The reason I didn't volunteer for VBS 2018 was because it took place the week after Fuge. Even before the bad stuff at Fuge happened, I knew that I was going to get really tired from it and would need time to rest, so I didn't help with VBS and instead got some rest, which was definitely the right choice given that I needed some time away from my church after the amount of shit they put me through that week. Anyways, I signed up to be a group leader for 4th grade. A fellow rising sophomore was also participating as a group leader for this group, so I wasn't completely filled up with a bunch of 10-year-olds. However, he was amongst the group that left me out and laughed at me at Fuge the year prior, but at least he wouldn't do anything too bad during this week. Now, our job was to assist the class teacher, who was in charge of the whole group. She was the one in charge of doing the Bible study and guiding the kids around, so basically like being an actual elementary school teacher who walks their students around the school to specials and lunch as I described back in part 1. So therefore, we walked the kids and even participated in their activities. So really, we were just mentors in the group. And as I'll get to once I finish discussing VBS, I was not a big fan of doing this, since if you saw part 1 or 2, you know I absolutely hated participating in VBS as a kid. Anyways, before I begin talking about VBS itself, I first want to talk about what made VBS different with this church compared to the other 2 churches I had done VBS with in the past. I actually once participated in a VBS held by this church as a rising 6th grader, since it was during the time that I was being transferred into a new school district. I talked about my experience with it and how challenging the transfer was in part 2 in case you're interested. But if you saw that story time, then you know that the deal with this church. But if you haven't, I'll explain some differences. So one difference about VBS at this church was that instead of VBS being a 4-day program, it was a 5-day program. So instead of being from Monday to Thursday, it was Monday through Friday. It was also in the morning, being from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m., so not at night like my previous church. Big downgrade for me since I absolutely loved VBS being at night at my previous church, since not only was it cooler, but I've always been a night person. Speaking of downgrades, another thing about how this church did VBS was that they wanted to make VBS as hype as possible. I'll get more into this in a bit, but in part 2, the last VBS I discussed was the VBS with the church I went to before this one. It was also the only VBS I actually enjoyed, as not only was it at night as said before, but it was also very quiet and calm. Even the big ass sessions at the start of VBS were really calm, as the music was not too loud, there were not any flashing lights, and I had a lot of space to myself since it wasn't very crowded. As someone on the autism spectrum, this really benefited me since I wasn't stimulated like I usually am in loud and flashy environments. However, this church believed in blasting music, crowded areas, and flashing lights, so I had to endure that during this VBS. A third difference is that VBS at this church ranged from kindergarten to 6th grade, unlike most churches where it is kindergarten to 5th grade. They did this because most kids at the church were in public school, and of course the district we were in had an intermediate school for 5th and 6th grade, so that's why my church did VBS for 6th grade. This would be the last year Zoe participated in it, since she had just finished 6th grade. After VBS week is finished, 6th graders, who are now at this point rising 7th graders, get to join the youth group, so this would be when Zoe joined youth, and over the years, she too would have a bad experience with our church's youth. So those are a couple things to note about how my church did VBS. Now let's talk about the actual event. So on Monday, June 24th, Mom took me and Zoe over to church. First, we had to go to the sign-up desk outside so Zoe could register for the event and I could get my volunteer tag. Afterwards, we departed and I met with my group. The teacher for the group was holding a sign, so that's how I knew where to go. I would be the guy to hold our sign, our group sign, so the kids would know who were in our group and knew where we were. This went on for about 15 minutes till it was time to begin. So when it was time, we as a group entered a sanctuary, which had been completely designed in jungle and wilderness decoration, since this year's theme was In the Wild. For those who've seen part 2, this is literally just Journey off the map, but with a different name and songs. Even the decoration was like the same, so it wasn't really anything too different from when I attended VBS here back in 2015. Anyways, we got in the sanctuary and holy fuck it was so loud. The church was playing VBS songs really loudly and lights were flashing, and overall, I was not too excited about that. The kids enjoyed it, and since this is for the kids, I guess it's acceptable, but still, I hated every moment being in the sanctuary since I was stimming quite hard and was shaking quite a bit. A little while later, the preacher took the stage and introduced himself and welcomed everyone to VBS. This was the start of Big Ass Sessions. Big Ass Sessions were really loud sessions where every group from every grade was gathered into the sanctuary. These were the first things we did each day. Here, the preacher would introduce everyone, talk about what we were going to study on that day, and then have us say the Pledge of Allegiance. Allegiance to the Christian flag, and allegiance to the Bible. Afterwards, we learned our first song of the week. During the first Big Ass session, kids learned the VBS theme song, which is usually tied into the theme. So in our case, the theme song was based around In the Wild and correlated it to the Bible because this is of course a Christian event. However, what made these really bad was that the songs also had dance motions to them. In parts 3 and 4, I went into pretty great detail about how much I hated doing dancing for warm-ups in PE. And in part 5 when discussing Fuge, I talked about the church clap being the third worst thing that happened on that trip. Behind, of course, being left out and harassed, as well as my birthday. So you can imagine that I've never been the biggest fan of VBS dances. And if you guess so, you'd be right, obviously. Even as an energetic kindergartner, I've always hated those motherfucking dances. Although much of it was because the music teacher at my old church was a hothead, I still despise dancing, and it has always been my least favorite part about VBS, alongside the noise. But VBS 2019 was different. Since I obviously wasn't a participant, I was a group leader. Therefore, I wasn't quote-unquote required to do the dances. Our church couldn't force us to dance, but they heavily pushed it. I made that realization very quickly. So while most others were waving their hands and acting crazier than a Pentecostal congregation, I was just standing there. However, I wasn't the only one in our group just standing there, as every single girl in the group was kind of in the same position as me. Meanwhile, the other group leader, teacher, and the boys were all dancing their heart outs. All the girls were standing together, so I told them that if they didn't want to dance, they did not have to and they could sit down if they wanted, since I could tell that they weren't really thrilled about dancing and singing. They all greatly appreciated me for telling them and they'll all sit down. We all sit down. While the class teacher wasn't too thrilled about me and the girls not participating, this resulted in me becoming very popular with the girls in our group, and as a result, I'd pretty much be the mentor for the girls while the other group leader was the mentor for the boys, and it overall worked out great. Once the big ass session was finished, we were then dismissed, so we all made our way to a classroom and started our first station, the Bible study. The boys and girls pretty much split up themselves, so that made it easy for me and the other group leader to know where to sit. Our teacher then introduced herself and talked about our schedule. Afterwards, she began the lesson. Just like all the other VBSs I've discussed in the series, I don't remember any of the lessons, so I won't discuss them here. Once the lesson was finished, we then went to our next station, crafts. Crafts were usually the slowest paced station since all we were doing was making a craft. My friend Zach, yes, he has the same name as me, was actually the group leader for it. So he pretty much showed everyone how to make it the craft and then went off to do his own thing, mostly to mess with me. I don't remember any of the crafts that we did at this VBS, so I won't mention any of them. Then after crafts came rec, or games as they were called at some churches. Here the kids get to play a game. Me and the other group leader also participated, which energized the kids quite a bit, especially the girls. Like, had I not taken part in the games, the girls likely wouldn't have played as much as they did. In fact, the rec leaders would often do boys versus girls games. I would be on the girls' teams while the other group would be on the boys' team, and we would often even beat the boys. However, rec can be exhausting, especially since it was 90 degrees outside. So once that was up, we got to go back into the air-conditioned church and partake in hands down the best station at VBS, snacks. As a kid, this was always my favorite part of VBS, and as a group leader, it too was my favorite, especially after coming out of rec since it was nice and cool inside. Snacks were different every day, so there was always something different to look forward to. However, drinks were always the same two choices, water and lemonade. Of course, lemonade was the more popular choice, which is actually quite surprising since on Tuesdays, our church pops popcorn. I understand drinking lemonade with brownies or other stuff, but who the fuck drinks lemonade with popcorn? Apparently these kids. After snacks came what was my least favorite station as a kid, music. I've always hated music because while it wasn't as loud or as big as sessions, it still involved singing and dancing, both of which I absolutely despise. I also hated hits since my old church, and since at my old church, the music teacher was always this mean woman who got mad at us for not doing things correctly. However, music at this church was much better. Music was run by our church's worship pastor, so he was in charge of the music during each Sunday morning service. He was also a very laid-back type of guy as well, which was perfect for the station since unlike the music leader from my old church, he didn't mind if we weren't doing things correctly or trying. In fact, even if nobody was dancing or singing, he was still excited and encouraging, so at least that made music better. He also didn't even require us to sing or dance. Like he said himself that if we didn't feel comfortable singing or dancing, it was completely okay and that we didn't have to do them if we didn't want to. Of course, me and the girls really liked this, so we didn't do anything while the other group leader and the boys went full out on the dances and singing, which is actually quite interesting because normally it's the girls who do the singing and dancing while the boys aren't into it. So it's interesting how the gender roles were reversed in this case. Afterwards, we returned to the classroom where my teacher gave one last lesson, and then we were dismissed. Although in my case, I wouldn't be able to go straight home, as instead I had to go to driver's ed since I still had a week left of it. Since my church was only about a mile from driver's ed, I simply walked from church to driver's ed. So that's how my first day at VBS worked and how VBS that week worked. But in addition to starting VBS that day, I would also begin something new on YouTube that night, that being a new YouTube series. So at the beginning of part 3, I talked about starting my YouTube channel and what all I did. I especially talked about the video game series my channel is based on, that being the Dimpman. And so from June 2016, when I started my channel, to March 2018, when I tried to kill myself and the start of my longest break from YouTube, I made a multitude of walkthrough series with the games, including a Coliseum series that was massively popular as I discussed in part 4. But then in part 5, and of course earlier this Storytime, I mentioned coming back to YouTube and the restrictions I had levied on me for uploading. Because of these restrictions, I couldn't do whole walkthroughs like I did back in the day, so I had to resort to short Pokemon videos that were utterly trash and still to this day some of my worst videos ever. But after the week before when I lifted those restrictions, I realized that I could return to doing YouTube series like I used to. So therefore, I decided that night, I would start a Pokemon Silver series. I pretty much recorded it the same way I used to record walkthroughs. I used a set of blocks to place my phone on and had my phone facing my DS, and it worked out great. And so from then until around mid-July, I recorded a Pokemon Silver video once a day. Even though I never finished the series, as I gave up from boredom once I reached Team Rocket's invasion of Goldenrod City, I still had a lot of fun throughout my time with the series. Even though I did disable comments for it, none of the other restrictions were applied, so people could still like and dislike the video, and I also uploaded multiple times a week, sometimes multiple times a day. I'd also even have Alex join me in the second to last episode in this series too, so it was still fun even if I never finished it. Now, the reason I bring up the series is because VBS nights were always very memorable for me for VBSs that I volunteered at, as they always felt refreshing being able to act more mature. While I'm actually really good with children, I personally am not a fan of them myself, as I'm someone who likes to be by himself and not act, who likes to be himself and not act like someone else. And the typical Zach usually swears a lot and loves talking about adult topics, something you obviously can't talk about with kids. Therefore, these videos were super nice because while I'd have to put up with my innocent persona at church that morning, I could go home at night and cuss in my YouTube videos, which was super nice. The same would be the case for VBS 2021, which I'll touch on in part 8. So then the next day, Day 2 of VBS started out quite normally. Me and Zoe, of course, were dropped off that morning, and overall, it started off quite normally. It would be this day when we started doing typical big-ass sessions, where the kids would dance and sing to songs learned the day before. Of course, neither I nor the girls participated, although the boys were sure dancing their souls out. Afterwards, the discipleship pastor got on stage and gave a statement about what we were going to learn that day. By the way, this is the same pastor whose house I went to and got support from back in part 4, in case you're wondering. Afterwards, we made our way to Bible study. Near the beginning of class, the kids did something that is done every year on the second day of each Bible study, that being the verse activity. So at every VBS, there's a Bible verse that goes along with the theme called the theme verse. Kids are encouraged to memorize this verse, often being rewarded with candy if they can recite it correctly to their preacher or the discipleship pastor. In this activity in particular, the kids were split into 2 groups, where each group was given a bag of words that corresponded with the theme verse. Whichever group could correctly lay out the words into the verse would win the activity. Since the class was very easily segregated, with the boys at one end and the girls at the other, the teacher made this a boys versus girls match. Me and the other helper were allowed to pitch in, although neither of us would be that helpful since we sure didn't have the verse memorized. Hell, I don't even remember what verse it was or even what book it came from, although this shouldn't be too surprising since this was all happened 6 years ago. However, there was a girl who managed to memorize the entire fucking verse the night before. I don't know why she did that or what, but she managed to memorize it and basically completed the entire activity for the girls group, giving them a super easy win. Now, other than that, the rest of the day wasn't all that memorable, and neither was the next day, so let's jump to Thursday. Now, Thursdays are usually the second biggest day of VBS, because after VBS ends, the youth group invites the 6th grade attendees to an entertainment center to basically welcome them to youth. VBS for 6th graders is pretty much the very end of being considered a kid at my old church, as once a 6th grader finishes VBS or once VBS ends, they start participating in youth. Of course, I never experienced this shift since I started going to this church at the end of my 7th grade school year, but that's how it worked for those who grew up in the church like Zoe. And that's what happened on Thursday, June 27th, as the youth group took the rising 7th graders to an entertainment center around 30 minutes southwest of the church. I didn't attend since I had driver's ed, although Zoe did since she was a rising 7th grader attending her last VBS this year. However, I did have a pretty funny ass scene that happened during driver's ed. So mom gave me some cash since she knew I was going to be hungry between VBS and driver's ed. So I used it to stop at a convenience store on my way to driver's ed, where I bought an entire 2-liter bottle of Dr. Pepper and a family-sized bag of Doritos. And during driver's ed that day, that's what I consumed. I ended up drinking around half of that Dr. Pepper bottle and ate around a quarter of those Doritos. Yeah, I was so hungry I went on that queso diet for lunch that day. Lucas made fun of me during the whole 3 hours since you don't just regularly see someone drinking out of an entire fucking 2-liter. And then that brings me to Friday, June 28th, the last day of VBS. Excluding VBS 2021, the best day of VBS was always the last day because I of course hated almost every VBS I worked and attended, besides the last one I did that I discussed in parts 2. And sure enough, that was the case here, as I was ready for VBS to be over. Even though I enjoyed getting to know and act as a role model for the girls, I was done with children and ready to resume my summer. Now, the way that Fridays worked is that the stations would be condensed and be slightly different. So there was the big ass session would usually be at the end of the day, meaning the Bible study would be the first station. So we did that and then continued with the stations, but they were shorter. But once we wrapped up everything, we made our way to the big ass session. I'm going to refer to this particular one as the biggest session, as the big ass session was much different than the previous one. This was more like a closing celebration, similar to what they did on the last day of Fuji year prior. So during this session, they would play all the songs the kids learned and they would sing and dance to them one by one. Additionally, they would air the finale to the video series. So at each big ass session, they'd play a short video of some kid or group of kids doing something really related to the VBS's theme that usually had a challenge that with the power of God, they could overcome. And in the final episode, the challenge is overcome based because the kid prayed enough or whatever the other bullshit they believe, then all is good. Simple plotline, but that's kind of necessary since these kids are between the ages of 5 and 12, so they kind of need one. Also, parents would also attend the session too to watch their kids and participate in a cookout, which took place after the biggest session. Here the church would serve hamburgers, hot dogs, and other foods for the kids and their parents. Ultimately, I didn't eat anything, as I had to head over to driver's ed. This is a big day for driver's ed, as it was our last day and the day of our final exam, so I needed to get there. But on my way there, I ended up running into my 6th grade English teacher. I talked a lot about him back in part 2, but to give y'all a gist, he was an incredible teacher who had such a massive impact on me as a student. It was because of his help that I managed to get so much better at English, my worst subject. He also encouraged me to read a fuck ton of books, which if you've seen part 2, you know I read more books in 6th grade in literally any time period other than 6th grade combined. So he really did a lot for me. So as you might expect, it was awesome for me now as a rising sophomore to reconnect with my old teacher. He also attended this church since he had 2 daughters enrolled at VBS, which is how I came across him. After talking with him some, I of course had my final day of driver's ed. Our instructor went over some final exam review stuff and then we took our exam. I don't remember the exam that well due to how long ago it was, but I do remember it being super easy and obvious, as I made 100 on it. So it was a nice way to wrap up the class. Now that's the classroom portion of driver's ed. There's also a driving portion that I would complete in July, so I'll talk about that when we get there, as well as discuss getting my learner's permit. Now, while volunteering at VBS was done, the actual VBS content would not be done until that Sunday at church. So during the Sunday service following VBS, they would keep the VBS decorations up, talk about how VBS went the week prior, and even sing some VBS songs during worship, where kids would be invited onto the stage to sing and dance. Me nor Zoe obviously did this, since both of us hated these songs and dances, which I think our parents actually appreciated since I don't think they were ever big fans of VBS music either. Some of the boys from my group went down and danced, but of course no girls did, as thanks to me, they did a grand total of 0 dancing that week. Afterwards, the preacher would give his sermon, where he preached from the theme verse and talked about it. Again, I can't comment on it since I don't remember what verse it was or even what the book it came from. However, I can comment on it as I'll comment on is the altar invitation. So after preaching, the preacher will invite anyone who wants to quote-unquote accept Jesus into their heart to come down to the altar and talk with them. It was here where one of the girls that I led the week prior went down and talked with the preacher. Soon afterwards, the preacher introduced the girl to everyone and announced that she had made a decision to accept Jesus. VBS had such a huge impact on her that she decided she wanted to dedicate her life to the Lord, which is what she did. I was super proud of her, as in Christianity, this is pretty much the best thing you could do, as being saved gets you into heaven. But on top of that, I also felt super proud of myself for helping someone get saved. Obviously now, this doesn't excite me that much since I'm no longer a Christian, but I still often get kind of excited thinking about this moment since I at least managed to be that good of a role model for a kid. Now, after we prayed over her and stuff, us as the congregation had the option to go down and greet her. While my family went their way, I went down to greet her and congratulate her. She thanked me and hugged me too, which was really sweet. Afterwards, I made my way to Sunday school. You know, I still to this day often think about that girl and the other girls I had at VBS this year, or I led, as I often wonder what they would think if they met and learned about me today. At VBS 2019, I was a role model for them and was even pointed to as a godly man that they should look up to. But of course now, I'm completely rejected Christianity and I identify as an atheist. I am also openly bisexual, which is amongst the worst sins according to evangelicals. I'm sure these girls would be absolutely horrified to learn this stuff about me. Nonetheless, I still hope these girls are happy and living fulfilling lives, whether they're still Christians or deconstructed like I did. They were great kids who made my job bearable, so I really hope they're doing well. Right now, they'd be sophomores in high school, so if any of y'all girls that I mentored at VBS managed to somehow find my YouTube channel or even remember me, I hope you're doing well and I wish all the best for you. And with that all finished, that brings us to July. So July 2019 would be when things regarding the guys in my grade got far worse. So if you remember from parts 4 and 5, I originally was great friends with the guys in my grade. They played a pivotal role in helping me feel belonged and recover after my suicide attempt. And they were all just fun to hang around as I got to experience at DNOW 2018. However, just 3 months after I tried to take my own life, these assholes would not only leave me out, but they would laugh and bully me at Fuge, causing me to end my friendship with all of them. However, after Fuge, I wanted to try to make up with them and become friends with them again, and throughout 9th grade school year, I attempted to do so. However, it failed miserably, as not only did it not work, but I ended up getting left out again at Winter Retreat 2019, and one of them would even sexually harass me in March, so needless to say that my efforts failed. and it would be this month when I decided that I was going to give up. After over a year of trying, my efforts not only didn't work, but pulled me further apart from them. So starting around the middle of the month, I began to isolate myself at church, often not hanging around anyone and just being by myself, as I wanted absolutely nothing to do with church. And I shit you not, a lot of these same boys who fucked up my time at Fuge and made my church life the past year absolute hell actually attempted to talk with me within the first week I started isolating myself. Yeah, I don't know if they saw me all alone and felt bad or what, but they actually tried to go up and pretend like it was the days before Fuge. But I saw through their bullshit, as I knew what they were up to. I knew that they were going to pull the same shit again in the future if I stayed friends with them. So when they did this, I would look the other way so they knew I didn't want anything to do with them, or they'd pretty easily give up. Yeah, these motherfuckers really thought I would fall for their bullshit again. I might have if I was a fucking idiot, but I'm not, so I ain't falling for or associating with them again. Now, even though I was now isolating myself from them and everyone else at church, I did have exceptions for Zach and Preston, as I would still talk with them. Preston, alongside his sister, who I sat beside on the ride up to and back from Fuge, would stop attending church regularly, so it wouldn't be often when I saw them. Preston's sister was actually a manager at a nearby fast food joint, requiring her to work on Sundays. Meanwhile, Preston grew disinterested in church and began despising church for pretty much the same reasons I did, as the way the guys from my grade treated me at Fuge and also had a big impact on Preston since they occasionally harassed him at Fuge too. And Zach was also very popular, being the son of the missions pastor, which usually left me alone, but I didn't mind, especially after everything that happened at Fuge onwards. I was done with church and done with these pieces of shit who took advantage of me at my lowest point to make themselves feel quote-unquote better than me. Now, even though I was isolating myself from church, I still had to attend church since my parents, of course, forced me to go. And this meant Sunday school, Wednesday night, and even Monday night small groups during the school year, meaning I had to deal with these assholes 3 days a week. Besides the sexual harassment issue, my parents did not know what was going on with me at church. They didn't know about me isolating myself, being made fun of, and harassed by the guys from my grade, or even what happened at Fuge. In fact, they wouldn't even know about the Fuge incident until I wrote and recorded Storytime 7 in February of 2021, as I didn't tell them about anything that was going on. So that's why I was still very involved at church, even if I didn't hang out with anyone besides Preston and Zach. I did, however, stop attending church trips. In part 5, I talked about how Winter Retreat 2019 was so bad that I actually stopped attending church trips altogether, as I would not attend D now that April. And this month, while the youth group went down to Charleston, South Carolina for Fuge, I stayed home. My parents were a little concerned that I didn't want to attend either or even any other future church trips, but they didn't ask any questions. I would end up going on one more, although due to certain conditions, it wouldn't be a real trip. I'll talk more about it in part 7. So yeah, I was on my own at church. After a little while, the guys from my grade gave up, and since then, I never spoke with any of them again. Of course, time would go on and I'd eventually forget many of their names, although I've since relearned their names after coming across all their Instagram accounts, where I have them all blocked. So it's very likely that I'll never interact with them again. It also helped that I of course went to a different school than them, as I'm sure I went to a high school with them, it would have been super awkward. I'm also not go to the same college as any of them 3 years later, which also helped a lot too. And of course now, I live quite a distance from my former church, with me now living roughly 45 minutes away. So I'm glad I'll never interact with any of these assholes again, especially since just from observing them in Sunday school over the years after isolating myself, they had not changed one bit. Now, in addition to not undergoing the same mistreatment I did while at Fuge, isolating myself would also allow me to take a step back and observe my church and their teachings from an objective view. Throughout the 4 years I stayed with the church after isolating myself, I would observe Sunday school and question their teachings, and I would do the same in preaching. It would be during this time period when I started to realize that many of the things they were teaching us were not only not backed by any real evidence besides the Bible, but were downright silly. Like in Sunday school back in 12th grade, I remember our Sunday school teacher talking about influence, and I shit you not, he said that we should only be friends with other Christians to make sure we don't run astray. Yeah, he was encouraging us to isolate ourselves from non-believers. When he said this, a thought quickly came from my head. Isn't the whole fucking point of Christianity is to spread the gospel to non-believers? Of course they make exceptions for evangelizing, but the fact that they discourage us from associating with non-believers because we might learn something different really opened my eyes to just how dangerous and even silly evangelical teachings are. and I was only able to learn this by viewing the teachings from an objective viewpoint and assuming the Bible is not the literal word of God, like I was taught growing up by my parents at church. I'd ultimately do the same, but with the other big parts of my church's teaching, such as their thoughts on marriage, families, and politics, until I would eventually start questioning the Bible itself in 2023, which is when I considered to be when I started deconstructing. And after 9 months of deconstructing, I officially left Christianity in March of 2024, and I have never looked back. If I ever do a series similar to this with college, I'd definitely talk about this, since it played a huge role during my last 2 semesters of college, because leaving a religion is very tough. As much as evangelicals want to claim it's the easy way out and that we just want to sin, the truth of the matter is that leaving a religion, especially a high-controlled religion like evangelical Christianity, takes a lot of courage, because Christians won't hesitate to attack you and try to validate your reasons just to make themselves better than you, which is exactly what the bullies did with me when they took advantage of me at my lowest point, as they wanted to feel better than me. Okay, that's enough talk about church. Let's move on and talk about the rest of this month. So during the first week of the month, we took our semi-annual, sometimes annual, trip up to Delaware to visit family. My uncle and his 2 kids live in Dover, which is roughly 8 hours away from where we lived. We usually went up to their house for a few days during the summer and right after Christmas, where they would often come down once during the summer and during Thanksgiving. As for this trip in particular, I don't remember it all that much. I remember that on the way home, we actually went through Baltimore as opposed to going on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge like what we usually do. I also remember on the ride up there where we stopped at Firehouse Subs in Richmond. I don't know why, but me and Zoe sat at a different table than Mom and Dad, and the 2 of us joked around and had some fun. But other than those cases, I don't remember anything else that happened during this trip. But the week after getting home from Delaware, I would begin the driving portion of driver's ed, so me and another student would drive with our instructor around the county. Overall, I did pretty decently. Of course, there were times when I fucked up, but I never fucked up that badly since I was already used to driving Mom's van, so I got through this portion pretty easily and finished up. And since I turned 15 back in June, that meant I was eligible to get my learner's permit, and that's what we did. Mom took me to the DMV on Monday, July 15th, where I took an exam on driving rules and on signs, where I passed both with 100. Afterwards, I was issued a learner's permit, allowing me to drive with a parent or guardian. Once I had my permit for a year and had recorded at least 60 hours, I would be eligible for my limited provisional license, allowing me to drive by myself between 5 a.m. and 9 p.m., which I would of course get a year later, and I'll talk more about that in part 7. Now, logging my driving hours would be super easy, as I would accumulate a ton of them from driving to and from school. My grandmother was in charge of taking me and Zoe to school, so how it would work is that she'd have me drive to Zoe's school to drop her off, and then we'd drive me over to mine, and then she and Zoe would pick me up from school since I got out an hour later, where I would drive us home. This resulted in me recording around an hour each school day, making it very easy to get driving hours on top of other times where my parents would have me drive. Also this month, I would do a week-long ACT prep session at my college. So funnily enough, my old 9th grade English teacher works for the ACT and writes exams for the ACT. And as you might expect, she knows all the tips and tricks for it. So I figured I'd sign up for her class, since even though it wasn't be until late into junior year when I would take it, I might as well get some practice with it. Overall, it was cool. It was nice seeing my English teacher again, especially since I ended the semester on such a positive note with her after having issues with her all year, but otherwise, there isn't much to say about this week. And that basically wraps up all of July. Overall, pretty big month. Additionally, that also pretty much wraps up all of the summer of 2019. Again, this was hands down the second best summer of my life, only behind the summer of 2018. It was overall a super relaxing summer, as I didn't have any schoolwork and was just in such an amazing position. This would also be, funnily enough, the last summer where I didn't have any schoolwork until the summer of 2024, the summer following my college graduation, as I would take at least one summer class each summer afterwards, although 2021 might be a stretch since I took a single 1-credit class that I'll talk more about in part 8. Nonetheless, it was a great summer where I got to relax a ton. I'm taking a water break. So let's talk about August 2019, but more importantly, let's talk about the beginning of my sophomore year of high school. So as mentioned at the beginning of this story time, the high school I went to is not your typical high school, as it was an early college. Additionally, this is an expeditionary learning school, meaning we did a lot more hands-on activities, which I usually learn better from. But in addition to more hands-on activities in our classes, we also did intensives, which were activities aimed at answering the theme question for each grade. For sophomores, our theme question was, how do I make good choices? Therefore, our intensives were structured around making good choices. And that's what happened on the very first day of the school year, on Wednesday, August 7th, as we would actually go on a 3-day intensive that would be much more different than any intensive we did as a freshman. But first, let's talk about my new classes. Now, for the first week and a half of school, I did not have any college courses, as they did not start until Monday, August 19th. Therefore, I only had high school classes for the time being. Now, this school year started off quite strange, as we ended up getting a new principal this year. So our old principal had a former student of his when he used to be a middle school science teacher who was murdered, which really affected him a lot, causing him to decide to go to his old middle school to be a principal over there. As a result, we got a new principal who would stay through the rest of my time at early college. She was really awesome, very fun to talk to, and a great principal all around. I don't have much to talk about her in the story time, but I'll get to share more about her in part 7 and 8. My first class of the day was English, which I had from 8:30 to 9:45. 10th grade English is also called World Lit because, well, it covers literature from across the world. Yeah, who would have guessed? I don't stick to referring to this class as just English though. As for our teacher, she was very interesting because this was actually her first year at her school. She had previously taught AP English at the school I did for driver's ed at, and after many years there, she switched over to our school. Of course, it was a huge learning curve for her, as not only were our classes just honors and not AP, but we of course did more hands-on activities. So we as a class had to help her get accustomed to the school and how we did things. Now, on top of just reading comprehension, we also did a thing called stems. So stems are basically prefixes, suffixes, and root words, sometimes called words within words. We did these in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, so these are the same things from parts 2 through 4. Unfortunately, we did not do the little actions like we did in 6th grade, but we were however given 25 stems to learn each week, and on Fridays, we took a test. These tests got really crazy, as our teacher would not only test us on the 25 new stems, but she'd also test us on 25 random stems from prior weeks, meaning we had to continuously study the hundreds of stems. This might sound like a lot, but you'll come to find that a lot of stem meanings are very self-explanatory, like bi as in bicycle means 2, tri as in tricycle means 3, and so on. Therefore, even without studying, I could have still done very well on these tests. I could just relate to the stems to words that they are found in, as well as of course from 6th through 8th grade. However, I still studied, as studying was made very easy thanks to my boy Dylan. So me and Dylan met at the beginning of 9th grade and were great friends throughout high school, and we're both still very close friends today. Anyways, each week, Dylan would create 2 Quizlet sets. One set was for the new stems, and another set where he would combine the new stems onto an aggregate set with all stems we covered. He shared it with everyone, making these exams very easy to study for and be very easy ways to keep our grade up. So yeah, Dylan, if you're watching this, you're a legend. After English, I actually had a college math class that hadn't started just yet. Therefore, me and everyone else in this math class had a study hall for the time being. I'll talk more about this math class later, but for study hall, I actually brought my Switch with me, so I played it while my friends watched me during this time. After study hall, we had lunch. Now, if you remember from part 5, lunch was usually awesome as hell, as me and my friends always ate out in the hallway and did and said some of the most random shit imaginable, most often involving us shouting the 15-word chain of cuss words over dying in Geometry Dash. God damn, those were good times. And the best part is that we got to continue them in sophomore year as well, as we'd sit in the hallway too and do random shit. But even better was that it wasn't just us, as almost half of the entire 10th grade class would hang out in the hallway with us, meaning it was quite a lot of us. In fact, sometimes our teachers would hang out with us too, making these lunches really awesome. Of course, me, Dylan, Edward, and Jackson would continue raging at Geometry Dash, but we and everyone else would also talk and do other stuff too. Now, lunch lasted from 11 to 11:30 on Mondays and Wednesdays, as from 12:30 to 1, we had crew, which I'll talk more about when I discuss college. But on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, lunch was an hour long, lasting till 12. Then from 12 to 1:15, we had seminar. So seminar is a weird class to explain, as I can't exactly broadly describe it like my other classes, as really we did a lot of different stuff. Basically, seminar was a class where we could do a whole range of different stuff for different classes. I think the best way to describe it is that it's like a study hall for certain subjects each day. Mondays were dedicated to math and science, Tuesdays were dedicated to intensives, Wednesdays were for college, Thursdays were for English, and Fridays would be for anything. However, Fridays were interesting, as while there were as they were for anything, we would be assigned a Newsella article to read and answer questions on at the beginning of seminar. I actually forgot to mention Newsellas in part 5, as we did two a day in English back in 9th grade. But basically, Newsella is this platform where teachers can assign news articles, and we would of course read them and answer 4 questions. I usually was never a big fan of Newsellas other than the way my 9th grade English teacher said them, as she usually said them in a very funny voice. But they were usually very low stakes assignments, as we just needed to complete them, so they were easy. As for my seminar teacher, he was very interesting, as he's already a familiar face here in the series, as he happened to be the middle school boys small group leader during the small groups at my church back in part 4. Me, the other 8th graders, and the 7th graders would go to his house on Monday nights, where we would play games, eat snacks, and receive a Bible lesson from him. And he just so happened to teach at my high school, and I even had him for my seminar teacher. He also taught geometry and algebra too, so students who didn't take these classes in 9th grade like what I did took him for those classes in 10th grade. He was also interesting because he would go on to be at the forefront of by far the biggest controversy my school ever experienced, which I'll discuss when we get to January. After seminar came yet another study hall, so my 4th block was supposed to be Earth Environmental Science. However, I alongside 8 others took it back in 8th grade. Therefore, we 9 hung out in the technology guy's room, where we would be time provided for us to take an online college class that I'll talk about later. However, I should go ahead and mention that absolutely no college work got done during this time, as we 9 pretty much goofed around and did some of the dumbest stuff imaginable, including but not limited to playing video games, writing the lyrics to the Soviet Union anthem on the whiteboard, and the infamous War of 214, that I'll discuss when we get to September. To distinguish this class from other study halls, I'll just refer to this class as 4th block. 4th block lasted from 1:15 to 2:30, after which we would have a college class from 2:30 to 3:45, which I'll talk on once college starts back up. Now, because college had not started yet, we had early dismissal, meaning we got out at 2:30 as opposed to 3:45. However, on my first day as well as in the next 2 days, I did not actually attend seminar or 4th block, as instead, I and the other sophomores would embark on a 3-day-long intensive. As mentioned, intensives are activities my school does that tries to answer the fundamental question for each grade. For sophomores, that question is, how do I make good choices? Therefore, many of our activities were based on making good decisions and how to make these kind of decisions. Intensives would often involve us taking field trips, such as the rock climbing trip up in Lenore and the tour of the city back in 9th grade, while some involved field trips coming to our school, as was the case with the bridge building intensive. This intensive in particular was a field trip, and on top of that, this would be an overnight trip where we would spend 3 days and 2 nights somewhere that I'll touch on in a bit. I always remembered the field trip intensive much more than the intensives where we stayed at school, and that would absolutely be the case with this one, as this would be by far the most memorable intensive I ever did in high school. Anyways, the intensive started at school right after lunch. 10th grade teachers gathered us into multi-purpose room, and then we started the intensive with the Building Background Knowledge section, also known as a BBK. Thank God it's a K and not a C. During the BBK phase, we do what's called a mystery piece, which is like an introduction to the intensive. During our freshman intensives, we would be in groups and be provided with a laminated box chart that had 3 boxes inside one another drawn on it. However, for our sophomore intensives, we were provided with our own sheet for the mystery piece. I still happen to have a copy of this sheet even over 5 years later, albeit it's a picture, not the actual physical sheet, but I still have it, and so I'll get to talk about this mystery piece from it. Now, the mystery piece consists of 4 parts that I actually got wrong in part 5. In part 5, I listed the order as common piece, gallery walk, expert files, and the mystery piece itself. However, after coming across the picture, I could confirm that the real order is mystery piece, gallery walk, common text, and expert files. I do apologize for making that mistake in part 5, as I wrote part 5 over 5 years after the start of my freshman year of high school. But now that I have more documents, I figured I would correct things. Anyways, the first part was the mystery piece itself. Here we are given an object, image, or video to look at, where we jot down what we see and some questions, which are called notices and wonders. In order to avoid confusion, I'm going to refer to this part as the introductory piece, since it was always the first part of every intensive we did. As for this particular introductory piece, it was a board game called The Game of Life. I've never played this game myself, so all I could jot down were things like, what is this game about, or this board is very colorful. The next part was the gallery walk. Here our teachers laid out a bunch of stuff related to the idea of decision making. While walking around, we again jotted out our notices and wonders. According to my notices, some of the pictures we were shown included dividing train tracks, a maze of elliptical illusions, the board game Chutes and Ladders, nature, and even drugs. Why the fuck there was a picture of drugs? I have no clue. I initially thought this was just me being the usual 15-year-old Zach, but sure enough, I actually wrote, "What do drugs have to do with our intensive?" in the wonder section. So I have reasonable suspicion to think that yeah, there was a picture of weed, meth, crack, or some other drug. Then we looked at a comment text. The comment text session involved us reading an article of something related to our intensive. From just my notices and wonders, it's not entirely clear what the article was about. However, it seems like the article was a story of a girl whose dad had supposedly died, often being visited by a postman who looked similar to her dad. She also lied about something, although I of course don't remember anything about the story. Then for our last part, we covered the expert files. Now this was just one expert file, as while I don't remember anything about it, it seems like that from what I wrote from my notices and wonders, it was about how if you focus on one thing, you won't be able to enjoy everything else around you. Finally, it was time to guess what we would be covering. All of us by this point had guessed this intensive would be about decision making. Sure enough, we were right, as this intensive would be about decision making and the importance of making good choices. Afterwards, our teacher spent roughly the next 30 minutes talking about decision making and the importance of making good choices. After that, we were ordered to grab our stuff, and soon afterwards, we began boarding the buses. Now, the school brought 2 buses with them, one for the guys and one for the girls. We also had assigned seats, which while that might seem terrible, our teachers specifically designed the assigned seats so that we would sit beside the person we were closest with. Therefore, this wasn't so bad. In my case, I was assigned to sit with Dylan, so this was really good. Now, the intensive took place in a little town in the northwest corner of North Carolina called Blowing Rock, a mountain town of over 3,000 feet above sea level. Blowing Rock is a popular destination for tourists thanks to the scenery, the nature, and being close to Boone, which is where Appalachian State University is. The town's roughly 2 hours from my school, so we had a little bit of a ride. So on the way up there, I did a Mario Kart speedrun while Dylan timed me. Now while the speedrun was cool and all, the ride was also fun since I of course was with everyone at school, most of whom I was quite close with. The whole ride up there, we would crack jokes and say some really stupid shit. But by far the wildest thing someone said on the ride up there was when we reached the city limits of Blowing Rock. One dude shouted, "Well boys, we're in Blowing Cock," and immediately me and everyone else started laughing. Our teachers either didn't hear or didn't care for it, but it was really funny hearing someone shout this, especially since our English teacher and my seminar teacher was on the bus with us. I'm sure this kid wouldn't have gotten in trouble for swearing or telling a dirty joke since we were all a bunch of 15-year-old boys and that's what 15-year-old boys do. But still funny the teachers didn't say anything, especially since both of these teachers were very religious and both of them attended my church. Now, we did not immediately arrive at where we would be spending the night until a little later. We instead made our way up to App State and toured the campus. I don't particularly remember all that much from this visit beside the graffiti tunnel, which had some really funny stuff, such as someone writing "George W. Bush did 9/11" and "Suicide is bad," followed by the word "ass." Afterwards, we made it over to where we stayed for the trip. Now, I do not remember the name of this place. While I believe it was off US Highway 321, I can't exactly pinpoint the exact location. Additionally, none of my peers I attended this intensive with remember either, so I would instead refer to this place as the intensive place, just as it did back in Storytime 33. Anyways, the intensive place was of course a lodging area in Blowing Rock that felt more like it was built for events like this. There were a multitude of cabins throughout the place, as well as places for meeting and outdoor activities. It even kind of resembled the church camp I attended during the summer of 2015 that I discussed in part 2. Once we got parked and off the bus, we were then ordered to find 3 roommates to share a room with. Now this worked way better than Fuge, as both the number of boys and the number of girls could be divided into 4, as I believe there were 20 of us boys and 28 girls, so my school for sure planned this out far better than my church planned out Fuge. I ended up going with Dylan, Edward, and Anonymous, who I brought up in part 4 since I roomed with him on the Wilmington trip. Once we got together, we were each provided the key to enter our cabin. Now how the cabins worked is that they consisted of 2 bedrooms with 2 bunk beds each, meaning there were 8 beds total in our cabin. There is also a room for the shower and sink and a separate door for the toilet. Why the hell it was designed like this, I have no idea. Additionally, we quickly realized some issues with the room in of itself, including rust on the bunk frames and all the power outlets in one of the bedrooms was not working. However, there was a huge benefit that we had in our room, that there were only 4 of us. The other boys' rooms had all 8 beds occupied, whereas we were the odd ones out without an additional group of 4, meaning me, Dylan, Edward, and Anonymous got to have all 8 beds. The power outlets were working in one of the bedrooms, so we used them to charge our stuff. Dylan happened to have brought with him a drop cord, allowing us to charge our phones and for me and Dylan to charge our switches since we brought ours with us. Additionally, we 4 were able to split the bedrooms, so Edward and Dylan took one bedroom while me and Anonymous took the other one. We each got our own bunk too, where all 4 of us slept on the bottom bunk due to the rust on the top bunks, so we did and ended up having a much better rooming situation than everyone else. Once we got settled in, we made our way over to the cafeteria, as by then, it was time for dinner. The intensive place served all 3 meals, although we only ate breakfast and dinner here. So we ate dinner and oh god it was nasty. I don't remember what it specifically was, but I remember it tasting awful. Luckily, Mom gave me $20 before the trip to spend on concessions, so I was able to just spend some money on candy, chips, and soda to keep me full. After dinner, we made our way to this larger cabin that had a large wooden room, similar to that of a conference room you see at many hotels. Here our teachers taught some more about making good choices and the things of that nature. They also talked about the importance of inspirational quotes, how to interpret them, and the impacts they have on us. Afterwards, they split us into groups. I was in a group with Edward and a couple of girls. We were then provided some markers and a poster board. Once everyone was handed materials, our teachers then told us to come up with and write down an inspirational quote. But in addition to writing an inspirational quote, we also had to draw some art along with it to make it, inspirational. Now, I've completely forgotten what we wrote for our quote, and I've even forgot what the quote was about or even the colors we used. But once everyone was finished with their quotes, our teacher called on each group to share their quote. We did that, and after collecting our posters and telling us that we would use these in the future for a project, we were dismissed. Ultimately, we would never see these quotes again, despite our teachers telling us we would use them again for a future project, which is why I don't remember the one from my group wrote. We would, however, do something else that would result in being used in a future project that I'll touch on later. For the rest of that night, we spent it in our rooms, and holy hell did we have a bunch of funny shit happen. My roommates and I stayed up to 2 a.m. doing weird stuff. One of the guys from another room actually started a group chat on Instagram for us all to interact with, which I of course was invited to. Here we sent a bunch of random memes and other really stupid stuff we were doing. One of the most memorable moments from this group was when someone asked me how my room was doing. I responded with, Anonymous is reading, Dylan is taking a shower, and Edward won't make it through tomorrow. Edward in particular was doing really stupid shit on this group chat, like sending some weird-ass voice messages typically associated with porno plots like stepbros, stepsisters, and stepmoms. Additionally, Edward ended up taking down the light panel from the ceiling in his and Dylan's bedroom. No idea why or how, but he managed to get it off the ceiling and then he put it back up a little while later. So it's safe to say that Edward was having a pretty wild-ass night. There's also another funny incident regarding a group of girls. So obviously, the boys' cabins were away from the girls' cabins, but not by that far. In fact, the cabins directly behind ours were the girls' cabins. And sure enough, one of them consisted of 3 girls who managed to get the attention of Dylan and Edward. Now, these girls were not from our school, as I think they were on some church trip. They were also much younger than us, as I think they were either 7th or 8th graders. Edward and Dylan were particularly yelling at them authoritatively in a joking manner, while the girls were doing the same. Eventually, the 2 of them introduced me to them. I don't remember what I said to them, I think I just said hello and that was that. A little while later, Edward decided to ask for one of the girls' Snapchat, and sure enough, she actually gave it to him, not only for her to block him immediately afterwards. So that was the last time he, as well as me and Dylan, heard from the girls. Now, while we were having our good amount of funny stuff, the other guys were having their fair share of fun too that we would get to see and talk about via the group chat. This was especially the case with Jackson. So Jackson decided that for whatever reason, he wanted to go under his bed. And that's what he did. He got under the bed because that's what he felt like doing, a very typical Jackson thing to do. He was also shirtless for some reason too. However, that's when he realized he was stuck. Thankfully, he wasn't completely stuck, as his roommates were able to get him unstuck by lifting up the mattress, but it was still funny looking at the pictures his roommates shared on the group chat. After all that, we finally called it a night and went to bed. This brings us to Thursday, August 8th. Anonymous woke me up at 7:30, and after I got out of bed, I walked with him, Dylan, and Edward to the cafeteria for breakfast. Breakfast was better than dinner, with the bacon actually being pretty good. Afterwards, we headed out and boarded the buses to take on a full day of intensive activities. Now, even though all the activities took place in the Boone and Blowing Rock areas, specifically around the areas around New River, getting to places takes a lot longer in the mountains because you often have to drive around mountains and go slower. Therefore, these rides were usually quite long despite the places we were going to not being very far away. However, despite being long, these rides were very memorable and very fun since I of course got along super well with my peers. We also got some super sick pictures on the ride too, as we often found ourselves on top of mountains and overlooking the rest of the mountains, so these were really fun rides. Anyways, our first stop was a research... Oh my god, my throat just... Literally I just completely lost my voice there. I probably need to drink some water. My voice just gave up on me for a second. That's wild. Anyways, our first stop was at a research center near New River. I couldn't find the exact name of this place online, although in past story times, I referred to this place as New River Research Center. Anyways, when we arrived, we were greeted by the scientists who worked at this facility and were given a quick rundown of New River. New River is a very long river that stretches across the Appalachian Mountains. It serves as a key source of water for along of northwest North Carolina, western Virginia, and West Virginia. It's also home to plenty of wildlife and plant life both in the river and around the river. Now, the first thing we did was identifying different wildlife in the river. So as scientists went over the different animals and taught us how to identify them. We also practiced examining and determining them with pictures too. The second thing we did here was probably the most important thing we did at this whole intensive, as we would later do a project on it when we returned to school. So the research center has a balcony on its backside that overlooks some really tall pine trees and some mountains. It's a very pretty view that also allows observers the chance to listen to nature as well, as you could also hear everything going on out in the woods. Anyways, we were each given 2 sheets of paper. For one sheet, we had to drag our view, and on the other, we had to write down how the view made us feel. Alongside the BBK chart for our mystery piece, I also found a picture I took of the things I jotted down in the drawings I made during the exercise from the same group chat, so I'll get to use them as a reference. As for the things I wrote down, I wrote the things you typically expect one to write, such as feeling at peace, hearing birds chirping, seeing a vast wilderness, and other stuff related to that. As for what I drew, or should I say attempted to draw, I simply drew the trees and mountains in the background, as I made it very clear back at part 5 when I accidentally painted a penis instead of a pepper on a rock that the school still has for display to this day. I'm not the best artist, and while I thankfully did not draw a penis during this exercise, my trees were terrible as hell. In fact, I put it very well in Storytime 33 when I said the trees looked like the New Orleans Saints logo with a giant pole going through it. As a Panthers fan, that makes them all the more worse since I fucking hate the Saints. Once we finished that, we left the research center for a picnic area right by New River. There were a bunch of tables laid out for us, making this the perfect place for lunch. Our teachers had brought lunch, so we just ate what they brought, which I've since forgotten. However, lunch was still memorable because of a really interesting find that Jackson made. Now, near the picnic tables, there was a public outhouse that also had a water fountain outside the bathrooms. Now, while we didn't need to use the bathroom, me and my friends decided to go over there and hang out. That was when Jackson tried to drink from the water fountain, but right before he put his mouth under the water, he noticed this water was opaque and white. Immediately, he moved out of the way while we all laughed. He then turned on the fountain again, and sure enough, the white opaque water returned. Now, as you would expect from a bunch of horny 15-year-old boys, we immediately compared this water to cum since, well, it looked like semen. Ironically enough, the cum water meme was quite relevant during this time, where a group of kids come across a similar situation and one of the kids said, "Look, it's cum water." For the rest of the lunch, we would impersonate this meme and pretend like we were the kids in it. I actually researched this, with incognito mode turned on, and it seems like this is because air mixed with the water inside the pipes, meaning the pipes this fountain was connected to were likely damaged. But I'd rather believe that a bunch of people went in, jerked off, and nutted all over the pipes, since that's a lot more interesting explanation than some boring chemistry explanation. Once lunch was up, we headed over to another part of the river. Here we did 2 activities, where the girls did one while us guys did another. Then we would switch. So the first activity, we actually got to go in a new river. A scientist went with us and explained how things worked. So everyone would be trying to collect as much wildlife as possible, and we would identify the animals from the strategies we learned while at the research center. There would, however, be one person who is responsible for collecting the wildlife, where they would hold a bucket and everyone would dump their wildlife in, and he would give the bucket to the scientist once in a while so he could secure them. I was the guy who held the bucket, so I had to plow through the river to get to everyone. The river was very shallow, only standing at around a foot deep. However, the bottom of the river was very rocky and it was very easy to fall, which I and everyone else ended up doing multiple times. Nonetheless, it was super fun since we'd also crack up, splash each other, and overall, we had a blast. After we wrapped this up, we swapped with the girls, who had just taken a mile hike, and that's what we did. I was not particularly a fan of this planning, as we were hiking immediately after getting wet, but thankfully it was like 85 degrees, so at least the sun could dry us off. During this hike, another scientist described a lot of the stuff on the trail, including the type of trees, plants, and other features found off the trail. However, when he wasn't talking, we were making this hike really fun. So during this time, the whole creeper aw man meme was huge, as this was shortly after Minecraft Survival. Basically, when someone says creeper, you respond with aw man. This meme originates from a Minecraft song by Captain Sparkles called Revenge, and with these being the first lyrics of the song. I and the other guys grew up watching Captain Sparkles and listening to Minecraft songs as kids, so this is a great meme for all of us. And for what we did here, well, someone would shout creeper, and then we would all respond with, aw man. We did this over and over, and it was always fun as hell. Even the scientist got on board, with him sometimes initiating it by shouting creeper and then us saying, aw man. After the hike, we were all dried off and ready to head back to the intensive place, so we boarded the bus and headed back that way. Now, the ride back was quite memorable, as Jackson would be the star of the show. So as mentioned back in part 5, Jackson was big in Geometry Dash. He, alongside me, Dylan, and Edward would spend our lunchtime in the hallway playing and raging at levels. Usually we were playing the RobTop levels. Later that semester, Jackson would introduce us to custom levels, so we started playing those since those tend to be a lot better than of course the main levels. However, on this particular bus ride, Jackson was playing a level called I Promise, a medium demon by Anzor. This level was obviously way above any of our skill levels, as Jackson's hardest was Dry Out, a 4-star, while mine was a 7-star level called Reciprocity. Demons are the hardest levels in the game, being ranked 10 stars and can range from Easy Demon, Medium Demon, Hard Demon, Insane Demon, and Extreme Demon. And demons tend to get exponentially more difficult the higher level you get. So you can imagine how Jackson was struggling with this level. And by struggling, I mean Jackson was full on destroying the shit out of his phone over this level. Like he was banging it so much that at one point, he almost threw his phone out the fucking window. It was hilarious. All while he talked to me calmly about the level, as he was just across the aisle from me and Dylan. Me and Dylan were dying laughing, as it was so funny watching Jackson get so mad. However, I myself became interested in I Promise, as I did a few attempts on it and found it quite fun. Therefore, I challenged Jackson in a race to see who could beat it first. He agreed, and the race was on. Well, we weren't exactly in no hurry, as neither of us had the skill level to beat even a very easy demon, much less a behemoth like I Promise. One of us would eventually beat this demon at the end of 2019, but it would not be until January 2021 when one of us actually managed to pull through and beat I Promise. Of course, it should come to no surprise who beat it, but I'll reveal the winner in part 7. Anyways, when we arrived back at the intensive place, we were given free time to shower, as that river was not clean at all. Me and my roommates took turns showering, and once we all showered, we headed over to the cafeteria to eat. After dinner, our teachers had a little party for us, which included them bringing balls, frisbees, and setting up a fire pit at one of the recreational areas. I, however, had already retreated back to the cabin since I was exhausted from people. As you probably could guess from this series so far and most story times, I'm quite the introvert, even if I could be very social in the right environment, so I needed time alone. So I spent the next hour in the room by myself, which felt super nice since I had time to decompress and relax. However, after an hour, I started to worry since, well, nobody had arrived back at the cabin yet. That's when I realized that everyone else was out when I checked the group chat and saw dumb stuff people were doing. I then asked where they were, and they told me. However, I had no idea what they were talking about. Luckily, Anonymous told me that he would meet me and guide me over there. Therefore, I waited on Anonymous, who arrived back at the cabin roughly 5 minutes later. He then guided me over to the recreational area, and that I'll refer to as, where I would spend the next few hours with him and the rest of my friends. One of the main things I remember from this little party, throwing frisbee. So all my friends were throwing frisbees with our seminar teacher, so I joined in with them and had a fun time. However, it was fun, and while it was fun, I and everyone else sucked absolute ass at throwing the frisbee, as we kept getting it stuck in the woods and hitting people because our aim was so bad. Nonetheless, it was still a whole lot of fun. Then once it got dark at around 9 o'clock, our teacher started a campfire, where all of us attendees gathered around, ate s'mores, and had a good time. Then at around 10 o'clock, the party was over and we headed back to our cabins. I don't remember anything that we did that night, so let's move on to Friday, August 9th. So like the morning before, Anonymous woke me up and the others, and then we headed off to cafeteria for breakfast. After breakfast, we packed up the buses and we made our way back to school. But before making our way back to school, we stopped at a mountain where we got to freely hike it and its trails for around 2 hours. We just needed to be back at the base at a certain time. I hiked the mountain with my friends, where we all said random stuff and did stupid shit that I don't remember. Our English teacher at one time joined us and hung out with some of us, and she also fell once, where me and everyone else helped her up. But other than that, I don't really remember that much from the hike. But once we made it back to the base, we had lunch. After lunch, we headed back to school. We arrived back at exactly 2:30, which is conveniently when school let out since college had not started yet. So once we got off the bus, I was able to meet my grandmother, who was waiting in line to pick me up, where she then gave me the wheel and I drove us home. And that wraps up the Blowing Rock Intensive. Yeah, it was a very eventful and by far the most memorable intensive I did while at early college. And while the activities were often not that enjoyable and tiring, I made a ton of good memories just from being with my friends that I still cherish to this day even as a 20-year-old man. In fact, this trip was hands down the most memorable moment from the entire post-depression period part 2, as I would kill to be able to experience this trip again with my peers. Alright, so now that I've talked about this trip, let's move on to the next week of school. Now, honestly, this week was not all that memorable, as college had of course not started yet. However, we did start work on our project for this intensive. Now, this project works similarly to our history of our city intensive back in part 5, where we were paired in groups and had to create a poster about a topic from the history of our city. We then presented this poster to our parents during SLC, or student-led conferences called SLCs. I taught more about SLCs in this story time since sophomores do them too. Anyways, on Tuesday, August 13th, our teacher introduced us to our intensive project. Unlike the history of our city project, this was a solo project, although we would still show it to our parents during SLCs that November. Anyways, for it, we had to create a found poem. What's a found poem, you might ask? Well, it's a poem created by reordering and presenting words from other sources. As for where the other sources came from, that would be the things we wrote down when we were looking out the balcony of the research center. Additionally, we had to draw artwork on a half sheet of poster board that went along with the poem. That artwork had to of course be based on what we drew from the art at that exercise on the balcony. Before moving on to the poster board, we would do a couple of drafts to make sure our stuff looked good, and then we would move on to the poster board. So for the rest of August, we mostly spent time doing rough drafts. I'll touch more on the actual finished product itself in October, since that would be when I did and finished it. Now, like the history of our city project, this project would be graded towards seminar. Seminar is a pass or fail class. To pass it, you have to get your SLC binder checked by your teacher and satisfactorily complete any intensive projects. So while we didn't receive a letter grade for this project, it was required to pass seminar. So that's that. Let's move on to the following week. So this would be a big week because this would be when college classes started back up. Just as a reminder, college classes were taken with the community college that funded our school. During freshman year, all our classes were either in the same building as our high school classes or online. And while the majority of my classes like this throughout my time at early college, there were a couple of exceptions from my sophomore and junior years where my classes would be on the community college's main campus. For this semester in particular, I had one, which I'll talk about later. For now, I'll talk about my first college class, that being Sociology 210, which is Introduction to Sociology. This class meant from 2:30 to 3:45 every day, Monday through Thursday. While this might seem like a lot for just a sociology class, this class was actually only an 8-week class, as it finished up in mid-October. Therefore, we had doubled the classes per week since this class is only half as long. As you might expect, this class went over the foundations of sociology, the study of different groups of people and how they interact with each other and with other groups of people. This class met on the college side of the building my high school was in. As for the professor, holy hell, this guy was insane. And by insane, I mean that this man was batshit crazy. I will admit, he was an extremely hilarious professor, but not because he could tell good jokes. He was funny because he was actually quite the opposite, as he was a super serious professor who wanted to control the classroom. He also had a multitude of catchphrases that made him quite memorable, with his main one being, "Sociology is a serious subject looking for serious students." He would of course follow up by telling that he was going to turn us into serious students, which obviously never happened since we were all very goofy. In fact, by attempting to turn us into quote-unquote serious students, he actually made us less serious, as outside of class, we would all mock and make fun of our professor for being like that, so his plan backfired immensely. We'd have another professor similar to him whose plan also backfired, and I'll talk about her in part 8. Now, even though our professor was a hothead, this class was very easy. Every 2 weeks, we would write a paper on whatever topic we were discussing in class during that time. These were very easy papers to write, as it usually involved us just answering a question or two in a 1 or 2 page paper. Obviously, this was nothing for me since I'm quite experienced at writing. Besides, even though this is a year before story time, I was used to writing essays, reports, and other stuff like this, as I had to write quite a lot of papers for English and many of my college classes back in 9th grade, so this was nothing for me. In fact, I'd often write these papers on the day they were assigned, usually being on a Wednesday. Because Wednesdays were dedicated to college for seminar, this gave me plenty of time to get ahead in this class, which is what I was able to do. Other than that, we would also do a final exam, called the comprehensive exam. I'll talk more about that at the end of the class in October. The next class I'll talk about is Math 143, which is quantitative literacy. So this class is like an intro to college math course, as it's designed in a way to prepare students for college math since it's a step up from high school. Students take this class after finishing Algebra 2, which I took in 9th grade. Of course, those of us who took Algebra 2 in 9th grade took this class as sophomores, whereas those who took Algebra 2 in 10th grade took this class as juniors. So there was also quite a few juniors who took this class with us. As for the course material, honestly, it was just a review of Algebra 2, as pretty much everything covered in this class was just stuff that we already knew. As a result, this is a super easy class. This class met every day Monday through Thursday from 9:45 to 11, although we usually got out at around 10:45. It took place in the computer lab in the college side of the building the high school was in, so after English, I simply walked over there. As for the professor, man, this guy was absolutely hilarious, and not in a bad way like my sociology professor, as my quantitative literacy professor was genuinely funny as hell. The reason he was so funny is that he was a massive Dolly Parton fan, and by massive, I mean that this man actually once appeared on My Strange Addiction for his obsession with Dolly Parton. Even his profile picture on his email was of him with Dolly, and our quizzes and tests would all be locked behind passcodes that were related to Dolly Parton trivia. Yeah, he was a super fan, but that made this class very entertaining because even though I don't particularly care for Dolly Parton, it was fun seeing my professor be all crazy about her and get excited sharing facts about her and the stuff she does. I'm 100% sure that he was somewhere on the autism spectrum, so as he was obsessed with Dolly that I can't imagine him not being autistic. Now, he was also very fun because of his accent. So he happened to live in the same exact town that I grew up in. This town has a reputation for being a super country and redneck, and while I didn't exactly adopt the same culture or accent, he did, as he had the super country accent and was also big into redneck stuff like tractors, hunting, and high school football games. But despite being super redneck, this guy has a PhD in applied math. So even though he might sound funny with him being redneck and being a Dolly Parton fanboy, he was an incredibly smart guy and honestly one of the most intelligent professors I ever had, on top of course being one of the funniest professors I've ever had too. The next class I'll discuss is Criminal Justice 111, which is Introduction to Criminal Justice. So the way scheduling for college classes worked at my school is that from Monday through Thursday, we would usually take a course as our last class of the day. But on Fridays, we would have our college classes in the morning, and then we would do our high school classes after lunch, but they would be condensed. There were a few exceptions where we would have college classes in the morning, as I already discussed with quantitative literacy, as well as another example I'll discuss when we get to January, and another in part 8. But this schedule format was usually the same each semester. As for the class itself, it was basically an introduction to the US criminal justice system. It was among the classes that we could choose to take. although in my case it was my third choice, as I believe my first choice was business law or something like that. The class met on Fridays from 9 to 11:15, although it wasn't uncommon for us to be dismissed at 10:45 or 11. This class also met across the community college campus, meaning at around 8:50, me and everyone else in this class would take off and make our way over there. As for the professor, she was really good and one of the best professors I had at early college. She was a younger professor who was really big into pop culture, and she was just really big into rap and could just relate to us really well. She also used a lot of Gen Z slang and just related to us super well, which is why I really enjoyed her class. Now, how the class worked is that the first half of the class, she would cover the weekly chapter, and afterwards we'd get a 5-minute break. Then for the second half of class, we were provided time to work on class material, which was usually some discussion questions and a chapter quiz. Not that hard at all, especially since these things, along with our exams, were open book. We'd also do a couple projects too that I'll touch more on later into the semester. Now, those were my 3 in-person college classes. I'd also take another in-person college class the second half of the semester once sociology wrapped up, but I'll talk more about it in October. For now, I'll talk about an online class I took during the semester. That would be Humanities 110, which is Technology and Society. This was an online college class I took in place of Earth Environmental Science. So instead, I was given my 4th block time to do this class, which I never utilized since nobody got anything done during that block. However, I still got my stuff done very quickly in this class, so that was that. Anyways, this class is a philosophy class about ethics regarding technology and society. Each week we wrote a paper about a particular issue on this topic. I don't remember any of the papers I wrote, and I'll discuss why in a bit, but these were usually roughly 3 to 4 page papers where we had to take a side and defend it. As for the professor, he was hands down the laziest professor I've ever had. And by lazy, I mean he was lazy as hell in a good way. The type of lazy where the professor doesn't give a fuck about their job, doesn't look at what you turn in, and just gives you free hundreds. That kind of professor. And that's what happened in this class, as he would just give me free 100s on literally everything I submitted. While I was skeptical at first, I figured that I was just that good at writing papers. Turns out, he actually didn't read them at all, as Edward, who also took this class, once submitted a complete blank document and he managed to get 100 on it. Yeah, our professor didn't even bother opening the damn reports. He just saw that they were turned in and gave us credit for submission. Definitely a great professor for a class like this that was just a gen ed. He would have sucked if this was a math class or a class related to business, but since this class wasn't that important, he was great for it. Now, even though I had 1:15 to 2:30 reserved for this class, I mostly got my stuff done for this class in seminar on Mondays, since of course my only high school class was English. So those are my college classes for the time being, but in addition to starting college courses, I also started 2 additional high school classes that weren't graded, but more just stuff my school did. The first one I'll talk about is crew. What is crew, you might ask? I have no fucking idea, and nor did anyone at my school. In fact, our school even had a phrase, crew is crew, because nobody could provide an explanation as to what crew was. But I guess a good explanation for it could be that crew complemented the expeditionary learning curriculum by going through the different themes of expeditionary learning by incorporating them into class-wide projects. It's called crew because our school motto was, "We are crew, not passengers." Now, the way crew works is that in 9th grade, you are assigned a teacher to have crew for, and you'll have them through junior year, as freshmen, sophomores, and juniors do crew. My crew teacher was my 9th grade English teacher. I talked a lot about her in part 5 because of just how big of an impact she had on me and my attitude towards improving myself as both a student and writer. But to give y'all a gist, we did not get along at all during the fall 2018 semester. But things got much better the following semester, and after she went off on how great of a student I was to my mom at SLC, I started to really respect her and we became very close since. As a result, having her as my crew leader, made that was much better as a sophomore and junior compared to as a freshman, making crew this year a lot better. And just to not cause confusion for part 5, I'll just refer to her as my freshman English teacher in the story time, instead of calling her my crew leader like I might have done in earlier story times. Although actually I might use those interchangeably, but be aware. Now, crew worked a lot differently this year than in freshman year. From the time the school was founded to my freshman year, Each crew would follow a booklet that outlined everything they would do for crew during each session, which was usually the same thing each year. However, this year, my school wanted to do something different, so instead of following a booklet, the teachers decided that they were going to do a more of a choose-your-own-path style, where individual crews would be given the choice of a few selection of activities they would do those. There would still be 3 things that all crews did no matter what, being the crew flag, the Rube Goldberg machine, and the amazing crew race. Now, in addition to these activities, we would also begin these things called crew jobs. Each month, each crew had an assigned job that they had to maintain. These jobs would change each month in order to allow each crew to do every job. These jobs consisted of things like cleaning lockers, picking trash up outside, announcing birthdays during closing circle, which I'll talk about in a bit, and more stuff like this. I've pretty much forgotten about most of these since they usually played a very insignificant roles compared to the actual crew stuff we did, but I'll briefly touch on a few of them. Now, crew took place on 3 days of the week. On Mondays and Wednesdays, it met from 12:30 to 1, meaning our lunch was only from 12 to 12:30 these days. Then on Fridays, crew was the first class of the day, being from 8:30 to 8:50, giving us 10 minutes to get to college classes, although my criminal justice professor never started class until 9:10. As for the first day, it was nothing special. At the beginning of each crew, our teacher had us take some of the chairs from the desk and form a circle, so we did that. Then for this particular session, she basically introduced crew and had us upperclassmen share some stuff about it. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I just remember sharing some stuff for the new freshmen. Now, the previous year, I and the other freshmen got along really well with the upperclassmen. I particularly got along well with a junior named Hunter, who often would throw fake punches at me since I flinch really easily. He was a senior this year, and we'd say hello all the time, and he'd often sit with us sophomores at lunch. See, seniors don't do crew, so I no longer had him to rely on. Thankfully, I got along well with the other sophomores, so I hung around them this year. The freshmen and juniors kind of kept to themselves, while the crew from my junior year would see something much different happen, and I'll talk about in part 7. Now, the first crew project we did wouldn't come until September, so for the time being, crew was more dedicated to introducing us to crew and getting the freshmen introduced to expeditionary learning and that stuff. The other new class I went to talk about is clubs. Like crew, it wasn't a class, but more of a fun thing we did each Friday that was usually the best part of the week. So during the second week of school, we set out to participate in a club, each one being participated by a teacher. This year I participated in sports club. This is a very fun club run by my old geometry and algebra 2 teacher from 9th grade, where we usually played games and just had fun. I chose this club particularly because this was our teacher's last year before retirement, so I figured that I would soak up one more year with him because he went off, as he played a big role during my freshman year and was even the teacher who interviewed me when I applied to go to the school back in 8th grade. I also had a bunch of friends in this club too, which is why I chose to attend it. Clubs lasted from 2:30 to 3:45, and they were also the reason why our core classes were condensed on Fridays. Then after clubs, we would wrap up the week by attending the closing circle. During closing circle, every student would circle up around the multi-purpose room while the teacher stood in the middle. At the beginning of closing circle, teachers would announce events, accomplishments, and other stuff. Then they would give the opportunity for students to do the same. Afterwards, they would do what's called a spirit read, where they would take an inspirational quote and read it aloud. After that, we would be dismissed. Closing circle was usually from 3:45 to 4 o'clock, meaning we were often dismissed 15 minutes later on Fridays. However, closing circle was by far the most flexible part of the day, as it could contain a lot more. For example, on the first closing circle of each month, the crew who was assigned birthdays as their crew would announce everyone who had a birthday that month. Of course, with my birthday being in June, I was never called out for my birthday. Also on the first closing circle of the month, they would announce a student of the month. Each month there would be a student of the month from each grade who was of course a great student. I was student of the month only once, but that wouldn't be until 12th grade, which I'll talk more about in part 8. Additionally, we would often use closing circle to show off crew projects, where we would be dismissed from clubs early to have a longer closing circle for those. Now for the most part, closing circle was quite forgettable. As well as a nice day to wrap up the week, it was just announcements and other stuff. Of course there was one closing circle in particular that was far more memorable than the rest of them for a very good reason that I'll talk about at the end of part 8. But for most part, closing circle was forgettable. So yeah, that's how my full schedule worked for the fall 2019 semester. This was by far the easiest schedule I had during my time in high school, as English was easy and all of my college courses were really easy too. So this semester had a lot more play than work, but I still got a lot accomplished this semester that I'm looking forward to sharing with you all. Now, before I wrap up August 2019, I want to go ahead and talk about a project we did in English. So our first project we did was based on a pretty crazy story of literary legend Ernest Hemingway. So the story is that Hemingway was at a literary tavern where he was challenged to write a story in just 6 words. Sure enough, he actually managed to do it by writing "For sale, baby shoes never worn." So for our project, we had to follow Hemingway's footsteps and write a 6-word story ourselves. My 6-word story was "Zach, get off the brakes, Mom." So the story behind this is that when I was first learning how to drive, I used to use the brakes a ton whenever I was going above the speed limit in an effort to slow down. Of course, back then, I thought Mom was an idiot because I was literally trying to slow down and the brakes are what you use to slow down. But now as someone who's had his license for almost 5 years, I can confirm that no, that's not what you do. Instead, you lay off the gas and let the speed dwindle down naturally. I still use my brakes quite a bit since my commute to work requires me to drive on 3 very busy interstates that of course both get lots of traffic, but that's the backstory for the 6-word story. And so with that wraps up August. August 2019 was a big and great month filled with excitement for the new school year and the Blowing Rock trip. Let's now jump to September. September 2019 was also a great month with a lot going for it. But to start, we're going to talk about something not so good, that being church. As mentioned earlier, I completely stopped talking with the guys from my grade as well as most people at church, as I was done with everyone's bullshit. However, my parents didn't know this, and as a result, they forced me to attend high school small groups. So as mentioned back in part 4, during small groups, we would go to a church leader's house, play games, eat snacks, and have a Bible study. High school guys' small groups work differently, as we would instead go to the church, but we'd still play games, eat snacks, and do the Bible study. I really did not want to do this at all, with me of course no longer talking with anyone from my grade or barely anyone at church, but my parents forced me to go, so I had to attend, and man it sucked. I of course didn't bother participating in anything, as I didn't play games and just stayed on my phone the whole time, but I was kind of that awkward kid who didn't do anything, which sucked. But I mean, I'm not going to be friends with the same assholes who bullied me at Fuge the year prior, so that's what happened instead. Now, staying on the topic of bad stuff, let's talk about how our school went on lockdown. Now, unfortunately in the United States, it's common for schools to have to go under lockdown from time to time. Throughout my time in school, I only ever experienced 3 lockdowns, 2 of them in 7th grade and 1 here in 10th grade. I discussed the 2 times my school went under lockdown in 7th grade in part 3 in case you're interested. Now, the lockdown took place on Tuesday, September 17th. The reason the lockdown happened was due to an incident that occurred on the main campus. So basically, there was this cosmetology student who was with a very violent ex-boyfriend. He was super salty about them breaking up, and as an act of hate, he sent her a picture of his gun and threatened to go into her class and murder her. He also stated that he was right in front of the college, and as he also attached a picture. Fortunately, the victim took swift action and notified campus security, where the whole college, including the early college, went under lockdown. This made sure that the guy couldn't get anywhere in the school, as when a lockdown occurs, it makes it so that you can't enter or leave any building until it's closed off. Additionally, the police were also very quick to find him and take him into custody. However, this violent man was not going to go without a fight, and by fight, I mean a car chase, as he put the police on a high-speed chase throughout the city and into 2 different counties, where he was caught in the nearby city of Lincolnton roughly 2 hours after taking off. I believe he ultimately served 3 years in prison, although I'm not entirely sure since I couldn't find an update to his case. Now, as for where I was, this happened right at the beginning of 4th block. So when we got an announcement from our principal telling us we were under lockdown, the technology guy got some sophomores and juniors outside the hall to come in, and once nobody was in the hallway, he shut and locked the door as well as pulled a cabinet in front of the door. He then turned off the lights and ordered us to hide underneath the desk or tables. I, Dylan, and Edward hid underneath the counter near the wall. This ultimately lasted for 2 hours, as it wouldn't be until 3:15 when the lockdown was lifted. Thankfully, we are not in any danger, but it was still a very scary experience knowing that it was actually possible that there was an active shooter on campus. Now, interestingly enough, our teachers couldn't provide us with the details of what specifically happened. However, we would learn the next day in sociology, as due to the lockdown, we did not attend college classes. Our sociology professor basically explained the whole situation as well as reviewed lockdown procedures. During the whole time, he got really emotional, almost even crying. While that might sound a little crazy, it's completely understandable since our lives were all at risk that day. Then that day after that class, our principal sent us home a letter describing the lockdown and even some of the details of it. Overall, I think my school and especially the community college handled this situation very well. They took the threat extremely seriously, as they immediately took action by placing the school in lockdown and notifying the police the second the threats were reported. And they didn't even end the lockdown until they were 100% confident that it was safe to do so. So I gotta give the college the praise for handling this very scary situation extremely well and taking it seriously. Alright, so now let's move on from talking about the scary drama to just plain stupid ass drama. So in seminar on Thursday, September 5th, things started out normally. We were provided with the homework assignment in English to do, which is what we were all doing. However, there was one girl who for whatever reason was really worked up. I remember her back in freshman year being quite bratty and annoying, and she was of course being the same way here. She was extremely spoiled, which should explain her crash out here. As for what she was bitching about, she was really worked up about the school. She was talking about how much it sucks, how much she hates it, and how she misses her friends at her old school, basically acting like a spoiled brat. Now, I get it, not everyone loves their school, as I for one absolutely hated both my intermediate and middle school, and even though I absolutely loved my high school and would do it again if I had the chance, I understand people not liking early college as well, as it's not your traditional high school and does things some people wouldn't like, such as no sports, having only 200 students total, and even the expeditionary learning curriculum itself. However, she never provided any actual reasons why the school sucked. She was just complaining and was talking about how much she hated it. Which is so funny because she actually did not even attend the Blowing Rock intensive, or even our intensives back in freshman year, meaning she didn't even get the whole early college experience and was complaining about it. But I don't know if this girl was just stupid or what, but she was complaining about the school directly in front of our seminar teacher, whose desk was right behind hers. He heard her and he had some comments to make about it. And by comments, I mean that he completely ripped this girl into shreds, telling her that there are so many students who applied to go to early college but didn't get in and would have loved the chance to get in and all that. He then told her that if she wanted to drop out and attend a traditional school, she was more than willing to do so. This really set this girl off, as she started crying and ran outside since of course being that spoiled brat that she was, she couldn't dare stand being yelled at. This would be the last time we ever saw her, as her mommy, who thought she was this perfect princess, would come in, pick her up, and even throw a fit at the school for making her perfect angel cry. Yeah, no wonder why this bitch acted this way, as she was a spoiled brat who was coddled by her parents. That girl would then never appear at her school again, as she would go back to her traditional high school. When she left the classroom, our seminar teacher warned us that if any of us didn't like attending early college, we could go with her. For the rest of the class, nobody spoke a word, as we were all scared shitless from that. However, this incident would spark a pretty controversial debate amongst early college students and even teachers. Some students sided with the girl, citing that she had the freedom to express herself and openly criticize the school as she wished. Others sided with the teacher because there's a time and place to complain, but that wasn't the time. I sided wholeheartedly with the teacher. For one, you don't complain about the school when you don't even participate in the activities that students usually are supposed to participate in. Secondly, while constructive criticism is always appreciated and important for the school to do things better, flat out saying, "it sucks" or "I hate the school" doesn't help anyone. It's just being a bitch. And third, she was not even supposed to be talking in the fucking first place. Our teacher explicitly told us to quietly work on our English homework. Keyword, quietly. This girl wasn't even supposed to be talking, and here she was yapping right in front of our teacher's desk out of all places. Damn. I can't even decide if I should be calling her a dumbass or an asshole, as she's clearly both. Alright, let's move on from drama and talk about academics. To start, I'll talk about what we did in English. So in addition to core stems, we also did reading comprehension. In particular, we were reading Night by Elie Wiesel. Wiesel was a Holocaust survivor who wrote a book about his experience in multiple concentration camps. This book does a great job explaining just how horrific the conditions were in these camps and just how evil the Nazis were. Now with the book, we read it and took quizzes on it, nothing special. However, what I really want to focus on is a project we did with it. So every book we read in this class, we did a project to go along with the book and the main thing we were trying to get at from the book. For Night, we were trying to analyze theme. Now, even though I wrote and published a book and I consider myself a pretty decent writer, English has always been my worst subject. But I'll try my best with some of these terms English teachers like to create that I as an author don't intend. Anyways, in literary terms, the theme is pretty much the central message of a text. It's basically what the text is about and is usually one or a couple words long. there can be multiple themes in a text. For example, in my book The Charm, depression would certainly be a theme, as the book follows my experience dealing with depression and suicidal ideology back in 8th grade. Coming of age is another one too, as I've always considered the day I attempted suicide to be the day that my childhood ended, which fits in perfectly with coming of age, so that's what the theme is. Or what theme is. And as you might expect, Night has a lot of themes too. So for our project, we were paired in groups of 5 and had to create a poster that represented a particular theme from the book. Now, our teacher used a pretty interesting method of splitting us into groups. Firstly, she asked all of our artists to raise their hands, or 5 students raised their hands. She didn't split them into separate areas of the classroom. Afterwards, she asked about math people. Of course, being a math person, I raised my hand. Conveniently enough, 4 others raised their hand, so our teacher equally placed us in a group. After we were placed, she didn't equally spread out everyone else into groups, giving us 5 total groups of 5 students each, since there were 25 students in the class. As for my group in particular, I was in a group with 4 girls. One of them who didn't raise their hand happened to also be good at art, allowing us to actually have 2 artists and of course me as the math person. Once we were assigned groups, we had to come up with a theme. Me and my group decided to do the theme of snow. Or not snow, sorrow. Sorrow is a big theme throughout the book, especially since it's one of the most evil things ever done in human history. We would work on this project for the next 2 weeks. We spent all our class time over the next couple of weeks working on it, and we would also spend seminar working on it too. Since I didn't have any high school math or science classes and was always ahead in college, I got to spend every day except Tuesdays working on this project. Additionally, the artist was in the same position as me, so she was able to go to my seminar class to work with me on it, allowing us to make a lot of progress on it very quickly. But on top of us two, the other 3 girls made huge contributions to the project too. Of course, one of the artists made more artwork, but the others did a great job going back through the book to find passages that related to the theme of sorrow. One of them also brought some materials we wanted to include on the poster. As for me, it seems like our teacher expected us math people to do some calculations for this project. However, I don't particularly understand why she thought there would be math stuff for this project, as the only math I had to do was taking measurements and calculating area in order to make sure everything fit nicely. Nonetheless, I did that, and I also spent considerable time on the Venn diagram, one of the things we had to include on the poster. Now, the end result of this thing was nothing short of a pure masterpiece. This thing looked absolutely incredible. First of all, the artwork was fantastically well made and well drawn. Secondly, this theme was super detailed, filled with everything our teacher asked for on top of additional stuff too. And third, this poster truly conveyed the theme of sorrow. If you just looked at this poster without even reading anything, you could tell it was about sorrow because the poster truly displayed the feeling of sorrow. You can also tell that we spent a good amount of time on this thing too, from planning to the execution, so it was a phenomenal project. But to our complete astonishment, our teacher was not impressed at all, giving us only an 88 on this project. The reason we only made an 88 on this project was because we did some things differently than what our teacher wanted. For example, I hand drew the Venn diagram and hand wrote the text in it. However, she wanted it typed, so she took off an entire 5 points for that. Yeah, she graded this thing very strictly. And it wasn't just our group, as she was very strict with the other groups too. In fact, my group made the highest grade in the entire sophomore class on this project. That's how strict she was on it. Now, that begs the question, why was she grading this project so strictly? Well, the reason is that she wasn't quite used to how expeditionary learning worked. One big part of this curriculum is that creativity and thinking outside the box are valued far more than following the rules. To accommodate this, teachers here would often provide guidelines for projects, but the guidelines would be very loose and oftentimes we would be given bonus points for creativity. This was especially the case with our 9th grade English teacher, who's known for giving extremely loose guidelines, often too loose. But our 10th grade English teacher, who had been teaching AP English for 2 decades, was so used to grading strictly like what AP does, and therefore just wasn't used to the style. Nonetheless, I still consider this project a success, and despite receiving a low score, in fact, I even consider this project to be the greatest project I did for this class and among the best projects I did during sophomore year because of how much time and effort I and my group put into it. Speaking of projects, let's talk about crew. So in crew this month, we worked on the crew flag. The crew flag was always the first thing we did each year in crew, where we would design a flag to represent our crew. The previous year, our flag was a dartboard and darts, with the darts representing each individual crew member. There was also the phrase, "Find your true north," on the top of the flag. This is a phrase my 9th grade English teacher's crew did each year, as it ties in with the expeditionary learning curriculum to find your true calling. However, you might recall from part 5 that I did not contribute much to it, or really any of our projects. That's because in crew, the amount you contribute is based on what grade you are. Freshmen of course contribute the least since they've never seen any of this before, sophomores do more, but it's the juniors who do the most. However, that was not the case with this flag, as me and the sophomores did the vast majority of the work, which sharply contrasted from the previous year where we as a freshman didn't do much. However, there was a junior who had by far the best idea for this project. He suggested that we do a Christmas-themed flag, where each of us crew members would represent a present, and our teacher would be represented by the Grinch. All of us absolutely loved this idea, although our teacher didn't like it, not because she was the Grinch, but because, well, it was September. So we scratched that idea, unfortunately, although I would have loved to see it actually be followed. So instead, we did more of a natural world scene. For it, we drew a lake at night surrounded by grass filled with ladybugs. The ladybugs represented each freshman and junior. Then for the sky, we drew some stars and the moon, where we sophomores were represented by the stars and our teacher was represented by the moon. We then wrote "Find your true north" on the moon. Overall, the flag looked absolutely incredible and we did a great job with it. We ultimately presented it during closing circle on September 20th. Well, the rest of the crew did, as mom signed me out early that day, so I got out of that. Now, moving on from projects, let's talk about a couple of funny things that happened this month. The first funny thing I'll share is the War of 214. So this happened in 4th block. Again, because we were always on top of our work, we never got anything done in this class and just messed around. However, on one particular day, the technology guy was out that day, meaning we 9 were alone, so we were able to goof even harder despite the technology guy always letting us goof off. However, I have no idea what led up to this moment, but Edward and another boy named Peter got into a joke argument. It was really funny watching them joke about each other, but then the two of them got really crazy. Peter began chasing Edward across the classroom while we all watched and laughed. But then Edward grabbed some crayons and threw them at Peter, causing him to chase Peter. This went back and forth for the next minute while the rest of us died laughing. They eventually stopped once they realized just how big of a mess they made, but it didn't take too long to clean up since me and the other spectators helped them out. But nonetheless, this incident was super funny and for sure showed just how crazy we were. We named this incident the War of 214 because it was at 214 when Peter started chasing Edward. It was also this month when our sociology professor went off on my friend Aaron for the dumbest shit. So Aaron was a great guy who was well liked and respected by everyone, including all the teachers and professors, and he 100% deserved to be liked, as he was genuinely a great guy who served as the class of 2022's representative for the entire 4 years we attended high school. He also served as the SGA president in junior and senior year and won by huge margins because, well, everyone loved him and he was 100% qualified for the position. However, there was one professor who did not like Aaron, and that was our sociology professor. For whatever reason, he did not like Aaron. I have no idea why, but he just didn't like him, and as a result, he'd usually get on Aaron for the dumbest shit. But by far the dumbest one was when Aaron left his phone laying face down on his desk. Aaron was simply charging his phone in class. He was not on it, as his phone was laid face down on his desk so that it was known that he wasn't on it. But for some completely bullshit reason, our professor took huge offense to this, so much so that he went on a full-on tirade about how the college's policy is that you can't have your phone out in class. By the way, this guy worshipped and followed through with the community college's code of conduct, so much so that he would reference it often when going off on Aaron or someone else. Oftentimes he would say, "It's not my policy, it's the college's," in order to justify his obnoxious rants, even though literally every other professor I had wouldn't mind us charging our phones in class. He then told Aaron to put his phone away or that he would be kicked out of class, which Aaron complied with and put his phone away. Once he did, our professor said his usual catchphrase, "Sociology is a serious subject looking for serious students," and then if we weren't willing to be serious students, we could leave. Of course nobody left, but absolutely none of us took him seriously. How the hell was he going to claim that we need to be serious students when he was going off on literally the most well-liked student in our grade, possibly in the entire school? Aaron got along well with literally everyone, including our teachers and professors, so why our professor wanted to go after him makes no sense at all. Oh, and the idea that our professor wanted us to be serious students is so funny because by doing all this shit he did, he was actually making us less serious students. Outside of class, we would mock him so much, joking about how stupid he was and how angry he was all the time. Just showed how ineffective he was and how he refused to relate to any of us. I also want to add that I heard from someone that our professor once said he hated early college students, often getting along better with the regular community college students and even showing favoritism towards them. Which then begs the question, why the fuck does he continue to teach early college students if he hates us? He could simply reject teaching us and that would be fine. This guy, holy hell, he was batshit crazy. Glad he retired a couple years ago because God was he one of the worst professors I had in high school. Alright, so moving on from crazy stories, let's talk about me getting inducted into Beta Club. So Beta Club is an honors club at pretty much every high school club in the country for students with considerable academic achievements. The academic achievements weren't really that high, so even though I kind of slacked off back in 9th grade, I still got in very easily thanks to my college classes being on a 5-point GPA scale and my high school classes being honors. So I got in very easily. Now, in order to induct us into Beta Club, the school holds an induction celebration for us. This year, they held it on the night of Thursday, September 26th, and that's what happened. I and the other inductees got to attend and be celebrated. However, what I remember most from this was my outfit. So the dress code for this event was semi-formal. My parents helped me pick out an outfit, which included a business jacket, some khakis, a button-up shirt, and some dress shoes. So I wore this at the induction. However, I was much more dressed up than everyone else, as most people dressed in typical church clothes. This made me kind of an outlier from everyone else, but that would be in a good way, as that would be the talk of the school for the next 2 weeks over my outfit, as people really admired how well I dressed and thought I looked great. So I got to be quite popular for the next 2 weeks for that outfit. Even teachers would get on it, which was really funny. I've never viewed myself as physically attractive, as I'm a 5'7", 150-pound guy with glasses and no muscles, and I doubt many others would find me physically attractive either. But for this day and the following couple weeks, I did feel like I was quite attractive. Now, in Beta Club, we did a lot of community service work. Well, the juniors and seniors did. Like crew, the youngest members didn't do much, as was the case with me and the other sophomores. This would especially be the case when we get to March, when a particular event causes community service to not be possible, and that would go for literally the rest of my time at early college. Beta Club was run by my seminar teacher, and we would meet for Beta Club every Tuesday at 12:30. Although this wouldn't be for too long since our leader himself had an issue come up in January I'll discuss then. And with that wraps up September. Not as eventful as August, but it still had its fair share of stuff. Let's move on to October. October 2019 was not as eventful as August, but it still had some stuff happen. I'll start by talking about the intensive project. So as mentioned, we had to create a found poem based on the things we wrote when looking out at the balcony at the research center during the Blowing Rock intensive. We also had to draw what we saw. All this so we could write a poem based on all this on a half sheet of poster board with the stuff. However, our teachers were extremely loose on the found poem part of the assignment, as they really didn't care what we wrote. So instead of writing directly what I wrote when doing this exercise, I decided to write my poem more in the style of Emily Dickinson. The poem itself read the following. I see the natural world, filled with numerous trees, waving at the sound of the wind and the birds chirping to the melodious tone. What beautiful and peaceful song nature offers, to greet hikers hiking the trail, so that they might hear the melody of the beautiful natural world. Of course, this poem is shit, as I've never been a poet, but it still did the job and was short enough to fit on a poster. But at least once I had the poem written out, I could begin working on the artwork, which was for sure the better part of the project. After 2 rough drafts and after being taught how to draw trees by my seminar teacher, I now knew what to do and how to do the artwork. The artwork consisted of a trail going into a deep forest of trees with a couple of mountains popping up in the far distance. I drew 4 trees with leaves and a few more really tall pine trees with leaves not visible. The poem itself was written underneath the trail, as this trail started in the bottom left corner, weaved around for a little while, then disappeared once it passed the trees. Overall, the poster looked good, and even though I completed it in an entire month early, I was finished with it and ready to submit it. So I did, and my teacher was satisfied with it, and I got credit for it. With all that wrapped up, let's talk about English. So now that we were finished with Night, we moved on to a book called Things Fall Apart by some guy whose name I'm not even gonna bother trying to pronounce. This book is pretty much about the Igbo group, a Nigerian tribe who lived their lives until some British priest came in and pretty much killed the tribe. This book was overall a very confusing read, as it failed to provide a good foundation and was just confusing. This was after we as a class did a research assignment on Nigeria to learn about the country, its people, its geography, and even the Igbo tribe itself. And because this book was not that good, I don't remember much about the specific literary thing we were studying. Hell, we even apparently did a project that I have absolutely no memory of whatsoever. I just know we did a project since I mentioned it back in Storytime 33. However, I think our teacher could tell that we as a class did not enjoy this book, as after finishing it, we watched a movie called Cry, Thy Beloved Country. This movie takes place in Johannesburg, South Africa during the apartheid era, so pretty much how like here in the US we have a dark history of racial issues such as slavery, Jim Crow laws, racial inequality, and more recently racial injustice with regards to police brutality, South Africa also has a really dark history with racial tensions. From the time the country gained its independence to the 90s, they had their apartheid era, where they pretty much made it so that black people were considered inferior to the notable white minority the country has. One such way these racist laws were implemented was that black people would often face significantly harder sentences than their white peers, especially if they committed a crime against a white person. And in this movie, that's what happened. This black man is basically arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death in an unlawful trial for killing a white man in self-defense. Unlike Things Fall Apart, this movie was really good, as it did a great job providing a foundation and it does a great job representing how unfair apartheid was. In fact, even though we did a small research assignment on the history of apartheid, the movie itself explained the situation very well and did a great job digging into it. Now, the specific literary thing we were searching for in this movie was symbolism. We didn't do any projects related to symbolism, as the next module would be entirely related to it, and this movie kind of introduced us to it, so I'll talk more about symbolism for it when I discuss November. Moving on from English, let's talk about crew. So this month we did our first Choose Your Own project, where we as a crew decided on a project. We ultimately decided to do an art project. For it, we would have to get in groups and try to paint a picture to be displayed in the county art gallery. Now, as I've made it clear throughout this series, and especially this story time, I'm not an artist at all. Thankfully, I did absolutely nothing except for a little bit of painting for this project, as I worked on it with the sophomores while the freshmen and juniors did their own. As for the finishing project, we decided to paint a tree. It wasn't anything special, it was just a big oak tree with a river flowing towards it. However, while it looked good, our teacher did not submit it to the art gallery. Instead, she put it up on the wall because she mistook our painting for the freshmen's project. So during this time, the freshmen were reading Speak by Laurie Anderson, which I also read back in 9th grade. If you recall from part 5, we had to draw a picture of a tree because that's what the main character did throughout the book. And sure enough, our teacher mistook ours for a freshman project, so she hung it up. For the rest of the school year, and even in junior and senior year, I would continually give my 9th grade English teacher a hard time about this, where she would always claim that it was so good she just had to put it up for display outside her classroom, denying the fact that she actually mistook it for our project as a freshman project. Now, I do also want to give my thoughts on this choose your own project system for crew as well. In my honest opinion, I thought this was a terrible decision by the school. Sure, doing the same thing each year might have gotten stale, but what was great about following the booklet and doing those things is that they were designed to incorporate the entire crew. Sure, the juniors would always do most of the work, but it was the fact that the entire crew worked on the same piece really made the projects and activities special. It was also easier for different grades to get along, as it was this system that allowed me and Hunter to become friends despite him being 2 grades above me. Whereas for the choose your own project systems, it encouraged each grade to basically isolate themselves and stay together, which defeated the purpose of crew and made it feel like each crew consisted of 3 different crews. It also made crew less organized and made it feel like we were doing shit just to be doing shit than actually learning something valuable from the expeditionary learning curriculum, like it was how in 9th grade. So that's why I wasn't a fan of this new system. And as the years went on, I felt like this system was dividing crews more and more, as during senior year one time, I observed a crew and noticed that each grade was usually separated and the crew just wasn't together. And unfortunately, I feel like it's still just as bad today, although I can't confirm that since it's been over 3 years since I graduated, but I do feel like that might be the case. Now, also this month in crew, we participated in the Amazing Crew Race. So the Amazing Crew Race is an annual event done each year where each crew competes for the chance to gain a crew color, which is the color their crew shirt is. There's a multitude of stations that consist of mini games and other fun obstacles, and then it wraps up in the multi-purpose room where each crew competes in a cup stacking competition, just that it can only be partaken in by freshmen. I don't recall this crew race all that well, but I at least remember that we didn't get last and our color ended up being purple. That's all I remember from it though, as it was by far the least memorable crew race of the 3 I participated in. So then moving on from crew, let's talk about college. So to start, let's talk about the end of sociology. So despite our professor being lazy, he was extremely generous with the, he wasn't lazy, he was crazy. He was extremely generous with the comprehensive exam. He allowed us to take it twice, the first time being Wednesday, October 16th, and the second time being Thursday, October 17th, the last day of class. On top of this, he promised that any of these attempts, if we score at least an 80, he will bump our grade up to 100. So he was very nice with this exam, which was great since it was worth 30% of our grade in the class. He also promised that he would grade these tests very quickly, as he was going to grade them the night of each day and would announce who made at least an 80 before the second exam. On top of that, he made it extremely easy to study for this exam by listing out every single topic that would be on the exam the week prior. I used his list to create a comprehensive Quizlet for each single topic and was able to study everything from there. So even though I did not like this professor, I have to give him credit for making the exam easy to study for and fair, unlike one professor who made studying for exams a fucking nightmare. My audit professor. So on the 16th, I went in and did the best I could. Sure enough, the following morning when I checked to see the list of people whose grades were rounded up, I happened to be one of them, meaning I would not have to take the exam again and got to enjoy 100 for the comprehensive final, giving me a 96 as my overall grade in the class. So while the vast majority of students were retaking the final exam the next day, I was playing Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Overall, I learned jack shit in this class. The only thing I remember from it was my professor, since he was sure one of the most memorable professors I had in early college, just from his wild-ass rants. I'd end up having a professor just like him who managed to fail even harder during senior year, and I'll talk about her in part 8. And so with sociology wrapped up, we had our next class of the semester, being public speaking. So this class spoke for itself, as it was about speaking in front of groups of people. For someone who's very introverted, I'm actually really good at public speaking, as I can clearly share what I have to say in front of large groups of people. This has always confused me, as I'm not as good talking with people one-on-one or in small groups, although I'm certainly better at it now thanks to working as a tutor back in college. I suspect this has something to do with me being on the autism spectrum, but I can't exactly confirm that. Anyways, the professor for this class was pretty cool. He was usually really calm and was also quite fun. So he was a breath of fresh air compared to my sociology professor. Now, the way this class worked is that we had to do 4 speeches in front of the class. A tribute speech to be done at the end of October, a how-to speech to be done at the beginning of November, an informative speech done at near the end of November, and a persuasive speech done in December. All of these speeches were very fun to come up with and deliver, and all of them were super memorable too. Let's talk about the tribute speech. So this is a speech where we had to give a tribute to a family member, friend, or a celebrity we looked up to. It was very similar to the speech we did back in communications in 9th grade, just that we had to talk about someone. For me, I decided to pay tribute to Masahiro Sakurai, the director of Super Smash Bros. And Kirby. I was really big into both of these games during this time. Anyways, I basically talked about why I was thankful for Sakurai for making these games and basically providing me countless hours of enjoyment and even creating my childhood. Even though I cringe a lot when thinking about this speech, it was good enough and everyone liked it. My professor also liked it too, giving me a 95 for it, so I guess it was worth it in the end. Now, to wrap up this month, let's talk a little bit about YouTube. So at this point, I was quite inactive on YouTube, as while I did quite a lot of speedruns throughout the summer and September, I stopped around that time. However, it would be this month when I started streaming myself playing Pokemon Showdown, an online Pokemon battling simulator. These would be very fun streams to do, as I'd often get Ryan and Robbie, 2 of my friends back from middle school, to join me, and we 3 would always have a blast in building teams, battling, and roasting each other. We'd do multiple streams like this throughout the rest of 2019 and throughout the winter and summer of 2020, as my channel would be pretty much focused entirely on streaming for the rest of 2019 and throughout 2020. It wouldn't be until the very end of 2020 and into 2021 when my channel went back to being more video-based thanks to the start of this series that you're currently watching right now. Although it would go back to being more stream-based the summer of 2021 for a reason that I'll discuss in part 8. And that pretty much wraps up October. Let's move on to November. So to start, I want to talk about student-led conferences, also known as SLCs. As discussed in part 5, SLCs are like parent-teacher conferences, except they are led by us, the students. Each year, freshmen and sophomores did 2 SLCs, one in November and one in April. During freshman year, we were provided with a binder and we would include the stuff we showed our parents. And in seminar, we were provided the checklist of stuff to add in the binder from each class. Now, my binder and checklist look really funny compared to all other students. The reason is because the checklist included all 3 high school classes sophomores usually take, being English, Geometry, and Earth Environmental Science, but the only high school class I had was English. Therefore, I had pretty much a completely empty checklist besides stuff for English and samples for my college classes, as we also had to provide samples of coursework for college too. We also had to show our parents our found poem, which was hung up on the wall. Now, funnily enough, my seminar teacher rejected my binder, telling me that I had nothing for Earth Environmental Science. Despite telling him that I wasn't taking that class since I took it back in 8th grade, he refused to listen, which really confused me since he knew I never worked on Earth Environmental Science stuff on Monday because, well, I didn't have that class. In fact, back in October, there was one instant where everyone was in Earth Environmental Science teacher's classroom and working on a group project while me and Dylan were the only ones in his class, and he played us a fucking movie. Thankfully, Dylan was in the same position as me. He came over since he overheard us talking and told our teacher that he too wasn't in Earth Environmental Science. That's when it hit our teacher that, oh yeah, these two took that class in 8th grade. He then profusely apologized to me and Dylan, and then to make things up, he signed both of our binders, allowing the both of us to pass the SLC binder portion of seminar for this semester. So with that finished, let's move on to SLC night, being Thursday, November 21st. Prior to SLC night, we had to select a time to do our SLCs. I always selected the 4 o'clock time slot because we actually couldn't leave the school without doing our SLCs. And also worked with Mom, who's an elementary school teacher. Since she gets off work at 3:30, she was able to drive up to my school at 4, and we were then able to get started. Dad of course worked till 5, so we never attended an SLC. Now, in previous SLCs, the majority of time was spent showing Mom through my SLC binder. However, because the only high school class I had this semester was English, I did not have a lot to show. I did however have a couple of projects to show her that were displayed in the hallway, and one in my English teacher's room. I'll start with the one in my English teacher's room, that being the night poster. Mom was thoroughly impressed with it, as she went on about how well made it was and how incredible it looked. So you could probably imagine the shock that flowed down her face when I revealed that me and my group only made an 88 on it. This caught Mom by surprise, as she, who was a strict grader herself, thought I and my group fully deserved the 100. But after that, we went into the Earth Environmental Science teacher's classroom, which is where we were scheduled to look through the binder. It was as expected, nothing much. Mom never asked any questions, and overall, it went well. Then for the last part of SLCs, I showed her the projects hung on the wall. The first one I showed her was the 7-word story. She found it pretty funny and relatable. And then we walked over around the school looking for my found poem. We eventually found it, but it was in a hilarious state. And by hilarious, I mean it was upside down. Somehow while hanging up the found poems, my seminar teacher hung mine upside down by accident, and it was only here when I noticed since I hadn't seen mine up just yet. Mom found it just as funny as I did, and after laughing for a little while, we finished up SLCs and made our way home. Overall, this is by far the easiest SLC I ever did while at early college. Of course it was easy because I had already done 2 and knew exactly how these went, but it was also easy because I only had one high school class to showcase, that being English. With our high school classes, our teachers would assign a few assignments and projects for us to showcase. Meanwhile, for college courses, we just had to provide a sample from each class, making them a really easy SLC to prepare for. So that was a nice way to wrap up SLCs, even if I didn't know that this would end up being the last SLC I did. Alright, so let's talk about academics. Let's start with English. So we finished discussing Cry, Thy Beloved Country, and moved on to the 4th module, that being the symbolism unit. According to the Sacred English teacher language, symbolism is basically when there's an object in a piece of text that symbolizes something to do with the plot, the character's feelings, the setting, etc. Even though I think most literature terms are complete bullshit, this one is by far the most bullshit. Like in The Charm, even though I never consciously made the theme about depression, I still made it a theme, and I certainly agree that yeah, it's definitely a major theme in the book. But nowhere in my book did I intentionally add symbols. I guess you could make the argument that Leslie's charm is a symbol to represent depression or some shit like that, but that's not why I fucking wrote it that way. The reason I wrote about the charm itself is because that's what I used to cut myself throughout the book, not because I wanted to symbolize some fucking bullshit. So that's why I hate symbolism so much, as I'm sure most authors are like me and they don't intend to add symbols. It's just something English teachers do. But despite my hatred for symbolism, I still had to follow through since my grade of course depended on it. Luckily, the book we read was super good. so that made up for it. The book we read was All Quiet on the Western Front. This book is about a platoon of soldiers in World War I. However, what makes this book so interesting is that while most books are in other media about World War I is based on American, British, and French perspectives, this book was actually from the Germans' perspective, who we were in the US often are associated with as the enemy during World War I. So this book was a very interesting read since the main character and cast are usually the heroes who fight the villains, not the other way around. Now, like the other books we read, we of course did a project related to All Quiet on the Western Front. So as mentioned, we read this book with the intention of finding symbolism in it. And while the author most likely didn't intentionally add symbols, the book did have quite a few. So for our project, we had to write a poem based on a symbol. Like our found poem from our intensive project, we also had to create some background art. Well, actually it wasn't art, we just had to copy and paste some pictures related to the poem and have them surround the poem. Kinda like to give it a dramatic effect. As for my poem, I chose to write about the knife the main character used to kill an enemy soldier. Without spoiling too much of the book because it's actually a great read, pretty much the main character kills an enemy soldier. This enemy happened to have a wallet on him that included a picture of his wife and daughter, which made the main character feel all the more awful than he already did. In fact, just to give you all an idea of how distraught the main character was, I'll go ahead and read my poem for its project, which I named the Death Striker. Through these bullets and shell fire, I hide in the mud. A French soldier comes near me, so I stab and spew his blood. Grief compels me heavily. I stab the life out of him. I try to bandage him up some, but he just still looks grim. I see his pocketbook beside him. I see pictures of his wife and daughter. They will probably be in tears when they hear their man was slaughtered. I can't do much for them, because they'd probably wish I'd die, so I put some money in his pocketbook and say to his lifeless body bye. Like the found poem, I personally don't think this is a good poem, as I'm just not naturally a poet like I am a storyteller or a teacher. However, I do think the Death Striker is considerably better than I See the Natural World, as I like the rhyming and I think I did quite decent at recalling that scene from the book, so I'll give it that. I also love the name of the poem because, for one, it references the symbol from the book, being the knife used to kill the enemy soldier, and two, it just sounds cool as hell. Like when you hear the word something called the Death Striker, you feel intimidated, and that's what I was trying to get at in the poem, so I think I did a good job with that. Now, I also like the background pictures too. I don't remember exactly what I put here, but I do recall putting some weapons on here, including 2 bloody knives. While maybe a little bit over the top for a school project, they perfectly fit with the poem and the scene, and they certainly added on the intimidating atmosphere. Overall, I think I did excellent with this project, and my teacher agreed, as she gave me 100 for it. While I still think the night poster was far better, I could certainly get behind this project receiving 100, since I did spend a lot of time on it, and it looked great too. So then moving on from that, let's talk about another intensive we did. Well, sort of an intensive, as it was a mini intensive that was only for a single 2 class periods and didn't have any project to go with it. So if I remember correctly, some students in Earth Environmental Science were not submitting good projects. Like they were okay, but they weren't high quality. At my school, they referred to high quality assignments and projects as quality work. So for this intensive, the teachers went over quality work. Now, honestly, this is by far the most forgettable intensive I ever did, as it wasn't a real intensive. It started out with a mystery piece, where we got to see some projects from students in the past. Then we actually dived into the idea of quality work, where we looked through some old projects and had to determine whether they were quality or not. Overall, this intensive, while easy and forgettable, was by far the worst intensive I ever did at early college. I've never liked how my school talked about quality work, as they could never use a clear and concise definition for quality work. Oftentimes it would be dictated by good artwork, but then our teachers would say you don't have to have a good artwork to produce quality work. Other times, it would be by doing everything asked and adding more, and projects missing stuff would be considered quality work because of good artwork. Additionally, our teachers were trying to make it so that quality work dealt more with artwork, which would make something like a research paper or basic assignment not qualify because, well, there's no artwork. So I was not a fan of this intensive, and I don't think anyone else was either since our teachers did not do a good job demonstrating exactly what quality work is. So you could say that the teachers did not teach quality work in this intensive. Moving on from that, let's talk about crew. So in crew, we began the annual Rube Goldberg machine, a crew-wide project. This is a contraption that, I almost said contraceptive. God damn it, I almost said, I said fucking contraceptive. That has to be the worst fail of any story time I've ever done. That's gotta be my worst fail. This is a contraption, not a fucking contraceptive, you weird-ass motherfucker. This is a God damn it, I almost said it. Alright. This is a contraption that attempts to complete a task in a really complicated way, trying to take as many steps as possible to achieve a certain goal. However, I and the other sophomores did absolutely nothing on this thing. This was mostly done by the juniors and freshmen, as we sophomores instead spent our crew doing crew jobs. During this month, our job was cleaning lockers. So me and the other sophomores spent our time cleaning lockers, which was actually quite fun since we all joked around and stuff while still getting stuff done. Now, taking a break from academics, I want to talk about a really funny incident involving Aaron. So it was a normal day in seminar. Most people were doing their stuff and minding their own business. Our teacher was at his desk reading a book. However, out of complete nowhere, Aaron just randomly shouted, "Spread them cheeks, teacher!" Immediately, I and everyone else started dying laughing while our teacher sat there, gave Aaron that confused look, and replied with, "Why would you say something like that?" Which only made the incident more funny. But on top of Aaron doing this, Dylan's reaction was even funnier, as his face had turned red from laughing so much. And then on top of that, he whispered into my ear that our English teacher is coming to clap them, only making the both of us laugh more. This would go down as the funniest thing someone said all school year, which says a lot since not only was this said by Aaron out of all people, but we always said some weird ass shit back in high school. So this is certainly no easy feat. And the best part is that Aaron's comment would go on to age extremely well 2 months later, which I'll get to then. So now let's talk about college. So to start, let's discuss the 2 speeches I gave in public speaking. The first speech I gave was a how-to speech. For it, we had to basically teach the class how to do something. For this speech, I decided to teach the class how to pronounce the word pneumono-ultramicroscopic silicovolcanoconiosis. This word describes a lung condition caused by volcanic ash, and at 45 letters long, it's the longest word in the English language. And as you might expect, it can be a tough word to pronounce as there's so many parts to it. But when you split it up into stems like what we were doing in English, it actually becomes relatively easy to pronounce since it's pretty much filled entirely with stems. So as daunting as saying pneumono-ultramicroscopic silicovolcanoconiosis might be, it's actually not that hard to learn how to pronounce, and it's really fun to say once you know how to pronounce it. Overall, this is a really fun speech to give. While the class did fail at pronouncing pneumono-ultramicroscopic silicovolcanoconiosis, as they certainly needed more time to learn in the time allotted to me, I still did a good job and made an A on this speech for the effort. The next speech I did was also a really fun one, and probably my best speech from this class. For it, I had to do an informative speech. So, unlike the how-to speech where we had to teach the class how to do something, for this speech, we had to teach the class about a topic and describe it. My topic was a really cool one, that being about Mario Kart Wii Ultra Shortcuts. So Mario Kart Wii is a very broken game, filled with these things called Ultra Shortcuts that often involve the player skipping entire sections of tracks, sometimes even skipping the entire track. You've probably seen a few of these if you know anything about Mario Kart Wii, as the Grumble Volcano Ultra Shortcut is world famous across the video game community. I'll link a video to the current world record time trial for the shortcut in case you're interested. So, for this speech, I basically explain what exactly an ultra shortcut is, why they work, and some examples of them in different tracks. I really enjoy explaining the checkpoint system, how the game records a lap, and everything else that makes an ultra shortcut work. If you're interested in that, I'll link Summoning Salt's video on the history of ultra shortcuts because he does an absolutely fantastic job explaining how they work and why they work. Overall, the class really liked the speech, as while most of them weren't avid Mario Kart fans like me, they enjoyed hearing about the details and seeing the crazy shortcuts from the game. My professor also liked it, although I only got an 88 on it. Now, also in public speaking, we did a midterm exam. I completely forgot about this thing until I looked through Storytime 33, but apparently it was a written exam about the course material. It was really easy, as it was just stuff such as overcoming stress and stuff like that. I made a 94 on it, but I didn't really have any memory of this exam besides what I wrote for Storytime 33. Now, going back to silly stuff, let's talk about Jackson almost breaking his phone again. So during this time, I started to get into creating Geometry Dash levels. Sometime in mid-November, I made a 5-second level called Short and Sour. It's a really easy and basic level that you'd expect to see on the Recent tab. My friends were all interested in playing my level, so they all attempted it. None of them got really far before giving up. However, Jackson was super determined to beat my level, so he gave it his all, and by his all, I mean he almost destroyed his phone while raging at this level. Like, he was throwing his phone down, yelling cuss words, and was just getting super pissed with the level. This is extremely funny, not because Jackson was raging like this, but the fact that he was raging at my level. I was inadvertently making him rage, and it was the funniest thing ever. He did eventually beat it, but it took him like 250 attempts. Nonetheless, it was hilarious watching him get pissed off at my level while me and our friends laughed. There was also a really funny incident that happened in quantitative literacy. So in class one day, we did an assignment on paper. It was easy as most stuff was for the class, so I submitted it and was supposed to receive 100. You might be asking why I say that I was supposed to receive 100, and the reason is because I didn't receive 100 on it. Instead, my professor made a typo when entering my grade and ended up giving me a 300 on this assignment. Yes, I made a 300 on this assignment. This shot my grade up to a 98. I was really shocked and happy to see this, as not only was it funny that I received a 300 on an assignment, but I also saw my grade shoot up. It should be glaring that I never told my professor about it, but it's still cool to say that, yeah, I made a 300 on an assignment. And as you might expect, this is the highest grade I ever made on a graded assignment throughout my entire academic career. Finally, to wrap up this month, let's talk about the first college entrance exam I took. Well, not exactly a college entrance exam, but one to prepare us for it. This was the pre-ACT, an exam designed to prepare takers for the real ACT, which students of course take in 11th grade. The pre-ACT works the same way as ACT, where there are 4 sections to the exam: English, also called grammar, math, reading, and science. Honestly, I don't really recall much from this exam besides the fact that I'd forgotten many of the ACT techniques my 9th grade English teacher taught me that summer, as I only made a 21 on it. I'd thankfully do a lot better on the real ACT, which I'll touch more on in part 7. Alright, so now let's move on to December. December 2019, like most Decembers, was a very eventful and exciting month. Of course, this month has Christmas, but it also marks the end of the fall semester. However, with it being the end of the semester, that meant a dirty 5-letter word: exams. Luckily, in my case, I only had 2 exams to worry about. English was a year-long class, so its final wouldn't be until May, and then I only had 2 finals from college, both of which were very easy. To start, I'll go ahead and wrap up quantitative literacy. The final for this exam was honestly super forgettable, outside there being a bonus question where we had to name a Dolly Parton song besides 9 to 5. I didn't know any songs by her other than 9 to 5, so I had to skip this one. Thankfully, the test wasn't that hard, and I even made 100 on it since it was a super easy 40 multiple choice question exam, so I still got through that. I ultimately ended up with a 97 in quantitative literacy, giving me an A for the class and my first college math class in the books. Next I'll talk about a class that I've barely touched on in the story time, being criminal justice. So for the majority of the semester, this class was quite boring. However, it did shine quite a bit at the end of the semester, so I figured I'll touch on that. To start, let's talk about a mock trial assignment. So at the end of the semester, we talked about the court system, so how courts work, some statistics about criminal trials, and other stuff like that. So for a project, we had to act out a court case. With our professor being the judge, we as a class were split into 2, with one half taken on one case while the other half taken on the other. For the case we weren't doing, we would be the jury in it. Now, the first group was the other case. I forgot what it was about, but I think it had something to do with someone breaking and entering and robbing a house. Me and my group talked for about 5 minutes on the case when we made our decision, and then once we returned, I, as the jury foreman, announced our decision. Not guilty on everything except the misdemeanor larceny charge, which we found the defendant guilty of. The defense had a really good case against most charges that the prosecution failed to provide good explanations for, which is why the defendant was only convicted of a single misdemeanor. Now, for the case that my group acted, I remember it very well. So in this case, the defendant was accused of being involved in a hit and run and DUI. I played as the defense attorney, so I was in charge of defending the defendant. We made an extremely compelling case, where we made up the story that it was her friend who took the car and hit the person while she was at home asleep. So that's what we did. We ran through the story and it worked very well, but by far the biggest highlight was that I cross-examined the officers who supposedly arrested her. These two were completely unprepared and had absolutely no case whatsoever, and the little evidence they did had ended up being thrown out because we were able to make them the case that the evidence gathered had violated my defendant's Fourth Amendment rights. And my defendant had also even was even able to shut up the prosecutor as well. So it was clear that the defense was going to win. However, the jury thought otherwise, as they ended up coming back with a guilty on all charges verdict. This completely shocked me, my defendant, the prosecution team, and our professor, as all of us thought the defense would have won because, well, I was doing that well. Our professor was also quite skeptical about this decision, as she believed that the jury might not have been paying attention during the trial, so she allowed me to do something very rarely done in the court, a motion for judgment notwithstanding the verdict, JNOV. This can be granted when the judge has reasonable suspicion that a guilty verdict from the jury is unreasonable. It does not work the other way around though, as once someone is found not guilty, they can never be tried again for that same crime, no matter how unreasonable the jury might have been. So our professor granted that motion, and as a result, we as the defense won. But on top of winning, I'd also be the talk of the town for the rest of the day because everyone was impressed with how good my defense was. I and my defendant prepared a lot for this case, even going as far as citing real court rulings in the US Constitution in our case. And everyone was quite impressed, especially since I left the prosecution speechless and made them contradict themselves on a couple of occasions, which is exactly what a lawyer attempts to do when cross-examining witnesses and other opponents. So I did really well with this case and made 100 on it too. Now, in addition to this case, we were also working on a project about careers in criminal justice. For it, we were split into groups and were provided with a career to talk about. My group was assigned a police officer, so we created a poster on that career path. We also had to create a PowerPoint presentation, which I did most of, since I was more skilled at working with than the other members of my group, where I left them to do the poster. Overall, it was easy and forgettable, as I don't really remember much from it. I do recall me getting an A, so that's that. And finally, to wrap up the class, let's talk about the final. So the final was really easy, as it was non-cumulative and simply about the last unit of the class. I of course don't remember much from it, but I do remember making 100 on it, so that all worked out. This resulted in me receiving a 95 in the class, giving me an A for criminal justice. Now let's talk about wrapping up technology and society. So for our last paper, we had to create a what-if chart, where we had to think of a cause and have to come up with a whole bunch of effects. It was actually a really fun paper, as it required us to really critically think about a topic. For mine, I decided to talk about if English wasn't taught, since that's of course my least favorite subject. As expected, I got 100 since it was my professor didn't grade shit. And with that paper turned in, my final grade for the class was 100, giving me an A in this class. But what's even wilder is that this would not be the highest overall course grade I would receive in a class for my time in early college, as there would be another class that I managed to get even higher than 100 in that I'll talk about in part 8. I also want to touch on my friend Eli, who also took Technology and Society this semester, although he took this class in person as his Friday class. Anyways, he had a really funny situation come up the night of the last day of class. Apparently he had some missing assignments throughout the semester and was just a little short of passing the class, but that's when he got a call from his professor. In the call, his professor was full on crying. While sobbing, he told Eli that if he submitted anything or any of his missing assignments, he'd give him credit. It was a super funny incident, and me and everyone else at school would mock for the rest of our time in high school. Eli submitted a blank documents for all of his missing assignments and ended up receiving 100 on all of them, giving him a B in the class. No idea why that professor was crying, but it was really funny that not only did a professor call a student, but he was full on crying while doing it. Now, the last college class I have to discuss is public speaking, so let's talk about it. So the last speech we did was a persuasive speech, where we had to persuade the class to take a position. As for what I talked about, I will actually not share since it was political, and I always try to steer away from politics in story time. However, I'll say that it was by far the worst speech I gave all semester, as not only was it just cringy in general, but my opinion on this political issue has since completely changed, with me now being on the I could care less about this issue side, as opposed to being adamantly for or against it like I used to be. So this speech did not age well, and I wholeheartedly regret doing it. However, my professor thought I actually did really well, as he gave me 100 for it, so at least I got that, but I sure as hell do not like recalling it since I cringe every time I think about it. Now also in public speaking, we did a final exam, although this final was more like a final assignment as opposed to an exam. It was an impromptu speech where we simply had to get up in front of the class and talk about what we learned from the class and all that. I don't particularly remember what I said, but I do remember making 100 on the speech, giving me a 94 and therefore an A as my course grade in public speaking. So that's college wrapped up. For the remainder of the semester until we were let out for Christmas break, we got to leave school at 2:30, so my grandmother would pick me up during this time and then we'd drive over to my sister's school to pick her up. Anyways, in English this month, we read a play called A Doll's House. I forgot what exactly we were looking for in this play. I only remember this falling into our unit on feminism. As for what the play is about, it's about a Norwegian woman in the 1870s whose life is pretty much dictated by her husband. I don't particularly remember the exact plot of the book, but I do recall it being kind of weird and all over the place. For sure it was better than Things Fall Apart, but it definitely was a weird read since I guess I'm just not used to reading plays. However, I do recall this being by far the easiest unit we did in this class. Not only did we not have quizzes on the reading, but the project for it would be really easy and fun. For it, we were paired in groups of 5 to 6, where we had to write a 4th act and act it out in front of the class. Even though acting it out was super cringy, it wasn't that hard since we could just read off our script during the play. I can't go into particular details of this act since of course it would spoil the play, but I will say that we were successful and received 100 on it as a group, so it went very well. Also in English, we did a midterm, but not a really scary one like what you might think. No, this is a super fun midterm that wasn't even graded. So as mentioned, our teacher originally taught at a traditional public high school, where she taught AP English. In AP English classes, the AP board assigns books and students are actually tested on those books for their final. Obviously, that was not the case for us for our final, which would of course be an end-of-course exam, called an EOC, as we'd instead be given passages and have to answer questions related to them. However, just for fun, we pretended like we were preparing for an AP midterm by creating Jeopardy games based on each of the books we read, the movies we watched, the stems, grammar, as we were also doing grammar exercises in English too. So this was a very fun way to celebrate the end of the semester and prepare for the next one. Now, once college classes finished up, high school finals started, so students in semester-long classes would of course take finals for their classes. As mentioned back in part 5, due to extraordinary events that I'll get to later in the story time, I only took 2 legitimate final exams for a high school class and all of my time in early college, and both of them being in 9th grade. After that, I didn't take a single final or end of course exam. Of course I was supposed to, but certain events stopped that from happening. And that was the case here. Most sophomores had to take their geometry and earth environmental science finals during the fall semester, but because I had already taken these classes, I got out of them. Therefore, during the geometry final, those of us who weren't taking it got to hang out in the earth environmental science teacher's classroom. During this time, me and my friends were playing Geometry Dash. Well, they were all watching me. I was playing a level called the Nightmare, an easy demon that's notorious for being one of the easiest demons in the game. Around this time, I had to run a 75%, meaning I was very close to beating it, especially since I already had over 300 attempts on the level, so my friends were watching me and cheering me on as I attempted to beat it. And sure enough, that magical run ended up happening during this time, as around halfway through our time hanging out, I managed to beat the Nightmare, marking this as my first ever demon level, and the first among me and my friends to beat a demon in Geometry Dash. I was super excited. And so were all my friends. For the rest of our time, my friends attempted to play the Nightmare themselves, although none of them were able to get further than 35%. However, it would only be 5 more days until I managed to beat my next demon, which I also beat at school. This time we were in the technology guys room while everyone else was taking their earth environmental science final. It was here where I beat the Lightning Road, another easy demon that's also considered to be amongst the easiest demons in the game. I found it easier than the Nightmare, as I took around 50 less attempts to beat it and had an easier time beating it in general. Nonetheless, I now had 2 demons. At the time, this was big since demons were so hard for me. Of course, that's no longer the case, as I've now beat well over 100 demons, including some medium, hard, and even got a 36 to 100% run on an insane demon, which in itself is harder than even my hardest completed demon. But for the time being, this was massive for me. Now, to wrap up the semester, on the last day before Christmas break, our school hosted a winter celebration to celebrate the end of the semester. I don't really remember too much from this day besides competing in a Mario Kart tournament and winning, since I of course speedrun the game. However, there's one particular moment I remember from this day, being a lip sync battle at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, they gathered the whole school into the multi-purpose room. Here, people could form groups of 2 and compete in a lip syncing battle. Me and my friends were at the very back of the back playing cards, as we were more interested in gambling instead of this battle. However, upon us losing a match, the winner told us that 2 of us would have to compete in the lip syncing competition. Now, none of us wanted to. However, Edward and Anonymous both agreed to join in, and they did, and holy shit was this so much fun to watch. So how this competition worked is that there were 10 groups who competed. The first round would involve all of them competing. The second round would be 5 of them, and the third round would be the finals, where the best 2 competed. The winners were determined by how loud the audience were. Therefore, me and my friends aimed to get as loud and rowdy as possible whenever Edward and Anonymous were finished doing their lip syncing battle. And despite being in the back, we as a group made a shit ton of noise. Not only were we yelling and screaming, but we were beating on the tables and just all around being extremely loud. Hell, we all ended up losing our voices and having bruised hands when this event finished because we were cheering them on so hard. Ultimately, we were so successful, on top of everyone else cheering them on, that Edward and Anonymous ended up making it to the finals. They unfortunately lost it, but the fact that we managed to get these 2 to the finals was absolutely crazy and hilarious. But the craziness didn't stop, as after the lip sync battle, it was our teacher's turn to be the stars of the show. So for the last thing we did that day, we as a school sang the 12 Days of Christmas. However, we didn't just sing the song. No, the school's American history teacher and the technology guy acted out the 12 Days of Christmas. The 2 of them not only did absolutely phenomenal acting out the 12 Days of Christmas, but they were extremely funny with it too and had the entire school dying laughing. In fact, me and so many others recorded them acting it out, although I've since lost the video to time. Nonetheless, this was absolutely hilarious and such an amazing way to wrap up the semester. And with that, the fall 2019 semester was in the books. Even though it was probably the second easiest semester I had at early college, there was still a lot that happened this semester, from projects to funny moments. Overall, it was a great semester and a special one too, as it would be the very last quote-unquote normal semester of high school I ever got to experience. And for my Christmas break, it was definitely a good one. That Christmas in particular involved me getting quite a lot of cool stuff. Some stuff included a new gaming chair, some Switch games, including Pokemon Shield, which had just been released a month prior, and some clothes. By the way, this break practically was dominated by Pokemon Shield gameplay, as I played through this game inside and out, and since I was super excited for it. And while it was one of the most underwhelming Pokemon games in the series, it was still fun and I enjoyed playing through it. So that pretty much wraps up part A of part 6 of the extensive reflection project. In part